an outgoing and vivacious mother.
Everybody that met her loved her. She would make everyday fun.
She was vibrant, happy. She was the life of the party.
Is savagely murdered.
The level of brutality that was involved in the actual murder was just shocking. Her throat was slashed almost to the point where she was decapitated.
Police hunt for an elusive killer.
We had nothing to tell us what happened. Crime scene evidence produced basically nothing.
We couldn't figure out who did it and why they did it. We were really baffled.
Could have been anybody.
And follow a twisted trail of evidence.
Why would he use a calling card?
There were 44 phone calls made up until the day of the murder.
The officer found a loaded handgun and hollow point bullets. It kind of lit up like a light bulb.
Until a desperate move.
This was really the one shot that the police had to solve this case.
Reveals a secret that stuns everyone.
I was very surprised, I was shocked. All of us were. I never would have expected that it would lead to this.
At 10:27 p.m. on a cold Tuesday in January 2003, Ramapo Police Dispatch receives an emergency call.
Ramapo 911. My neighbor just ran in my house and said his wife is on the floor in the house. He's here and he's sort of in a state of shock.
Let me talk to him on the phone.
All right, hold on a minute.
Yes. Sir, I have help on the way. You stay right where you are until the officers get there. Do you know if your wife is breathing?
No. She didn't answer me.
Did you check to see if she was
breathing?
breathing?
I walked into her room. The lights don't go on.
Okay. Does she have any injuries?
Yes, she's got blood on her.
Where?
When I cried, Evelyn, she didn't move.
Did you come home and find her that way?
I just came home.
Officers are dispatched to the home, located in a quiet family neighborhood.
When I initially approached the house, I see a man with a young boy with this really blank face. Walking by, he didn't say anything to me. I noticed that he had a shopping bag. It looked like a gallon of milk. I enter the home and go upstairs to the back rear bedroom to give this woman aid, only to find that I was at the scene of a murder. Her injuries were so severe. She's clearly dead. She's a very deep laceration to her neck, and she has what appears to be a knife handle sticking out of her chest. And the blood is just pooled around her body. To me, it looked like the blood was still moving. And I was thinking to myself, this just happened. It could be that the killer's still in the house. So myself and another police officer went room by room and cleared the house, and we didn't find anybody else inside. At that point now, I had to secure the crime scene. I knew that it was dark, but once it's a crime scene, you try not to touch anything because you don't know what is evidence.
Detectives arrive on the scene and begin their investigation in the bedroom.
The victim was lying on her back, and she had a tremendously deep wound to her neck. So deep so, you could see part of her spine. There appeared to be 2 stab wounds to her chest, and there was a large, I would call it a kitchen knife, sticking in her chest. We, of course, dusted the knife for fingerprints, which came back negative.
The actual blade had gone through her and was stuck into the parquet wood floor. It was a pretty brutal scene.
She didn't appear to be dead for long. Her body was cold to the touch, but there was no rigor mortis. There was no lividity. We looked at a potential attack of a sexual nature. There was nothing obvious to the eye. Her clothing was not disturbed. I looked for any defensive wounds. If there was a struggle, there'd be some indication on her hands, and none of that was evident.
The brutality of her injuries and how many times she had been stabbed, it looked more like what we would call a crime of passion.
Looking around the room, investigators discover some unusual clues.
I found it kind of odd that there was no lights, but the fan in the ceiling was running. The fan light had no light bulbs in it. And in the garbage basket were 3 light bulbs, and there was one on the floor next to it. And I'm like, that just, what's this all about? And there was a wall sconce that had a light bulb that was loosened. To me, it would be indicative of somebody looking to hide their presence, lessen the ability of the victim to see them.
The house was a little bit in disarray, but it didn't look like it had been ransacked or that it was part of a burglary.
There was some expensive tools in the garage. There was quite a bit of silverware, which is a burglar. They would take that, I would think.
Nothing really of value was taken, and so that started raising more questions of what exactly happened here.
Police examined the exterior of the house for evidence.
We didn't see any types of breaks in the windows or the screens. Everything appeared to be locked and secure. On the ground, you could see a set of footprints in the snow that led to the back door. And that door wasn't broken open, but it was open just slightly. That could have been a point of entry for whoever had done this to her.
Investigators speak with the homeowner, Peter Visich. He tells police the victim is his wife, 36-year-old Evelyn Visich, and that they live in the house with their 2-year-old son, Ryan.
Peter told the police he'd gotten home with his son and that he observed that something happened to his wife. When the police spoke to Peter and explained to him what exactly happened to his wife, Evelyn, it was a strange reaction.
He just sort of had a very stale face. That was something that was odd to me, but it certainly didn't point any fingers at him. There was no blood and nothing in his hands or on him or on his clothes that would indicate that he had been part of the murder.
While Peter is taken to headquarters to make a statement, Ryan is looked after by his grandparents. At the crime scene, investigators continue to look for any clues to who has killed Evelyn Visich.
In these early stages, you don't really know the victim, and so now you have to start thinking, who would do that, and what was the reason for this brutality that was leveled against this victim?
Born to a single mother in Lares, Puerto Rico in 1966, Evelyn grew up determined to escape her humble childhood.
She came to this country from Puerto Rico when she was 19 to live the American dream.
Evelyn landed a job at a large home improvement store in Paramus, New Jersey, where she made an immediate impression.
Evelyn was a great employee. She had such a good work ethic. Everybody loved her.
She was vibrant, positive. You could hear Evelyn from a mile away. She was always happy. She loved her music. She was passionate about dancing. She was a proud Latina.
She was beautiful inside and out. Such a giving person. She was very kind.
Evelyn started dating Peter after they met at the store.
Peter used to shop there with his father. He was very quiet, very polite, family-oriented. He seemed like a good guy. Someone that she could see building a family with. That was her dream.
Peter and Evelyn married and soon welcomed their son Ryan into the family.
Ryan was her world. Everyone knew she had a son, and everyone knew how much she loved her son.
After 4 years of marriage, the couple's relationship deteriorated, and Evelyn filed for divorce.
Things started to go wrong. They were just very disconnected. But she wanted Peter to be a part of Ryan's life while they figured out their divorce and custody agreement.
But Evelyn was killed before the divorce was finalized, raising police suspicions due to the nature of her murder.
The ferocity, the level of violence, you would think somebody really had an axe to grind, someone that's personally involved with the victim.
You looked at the nature of the crime, it suggested that it was somebody doing this for a reason. You have a couple who are going through a divorce. In these types of cases, you're going to look at the husband.
Coming up, police discover additional suspects.
We learned that he had been with Evelyn the night of the murder.
Maybe they were having a domestic argument, a dispute.
And unearth hidden evidence.
Evelyn had secretly audio taped some of the arguments and fights that they had been having.
But just as the investigation falters,
maybe he wasn't the one who actually did the murder because it just doesn't make sense.
Was there a piece of the puzzle that we weren't seeing?
A new face blows the case wide open.
He's perspiring heavily. I could see the vein in his neck beating. And I said to him, I don't want to hear what you have to say. I already know what happened, and I'm going to prove it.
Police investigating the murder of mother of one, Evelyn Visage, have their first suspect, her estranged husband, Peter Visage.
You have to start thinking, did the husband do this, or is he involved in it somehow?
Peter mentioned that his relationship with Evelyn was troubling to him because they were in a different place. He wanted her to stay home, she wanted to work, and the relationship deteriorated, and Evelyn had filed for divorce.
Evelyn and Peter still lived in the same home even though this divorce was proceeding. They slept in separate bedrooms, but they were living under the same roof.
Peter claims he last saw Evelyn alive the morning she was killed.
He had taken his son for the day. Evelyn had gone to work.
Peter told us he went to his mother's house at 8:30 that morning with Ryan to do some household repairs. He didn't have a steady job. His parents supported him. He also did a lot of odd jobs for them that they paid him for. He stayed at his mother's house till approximately 8:30, and at that time he went with his son Ryan to the Palisades Mall.
Peter tells police that just after 9 p.m., he called Evelyn's cell, and she told him she was at a friend's house.
She told Peter that she was on her way home and would probably be home within 20 minutes or so. At approximately 10 p.m., Peter received a telephone call from Evelyn asking where he was. Peter said to Evelyn that he was picking up milk and that he would be home shortly. Peter said that upon arriving home, his intent was to put Ryan to bed, but he said that he found it odd that the lights were not working in the hallway. He said he looked into the bedroom, he saw that Evelyn was on the floor, and he said that she was obviously deceased, according to him, and he ran back downstairs and ran to the neighbor's house to call the police.
Peter Visage was questioned for over 16 hours. I mean, it was a very long interview. He never asked to leave. He never said, I want a lawyer, leave me alone, anything like that. He was cooperative throughout.
He agreed to provide us with fingernail clippings, hair samples, blood sample, a buccal swab for his DNA.
As Peter is providing samples, investigators run a background check.
There was nothing in his history indicative of this violence. Peter was typically a guy who was, if he wasn't home, working on cars, motorcycles, he was at his parents' house. Peter Visage's mother confirmed his alibi for the day and evening at the time that he said that he was there. We found Peter to be at the A&P supermarket buying milk and exiting the store consistent with the times he described, confirmed by video cameras. And he produced a receipt for the milk, time and date stamped 10:15 p.m. The amount of time it took to go from A&P, where he purchased the milk, to his house, it just would not have been possible to commit that crime and call the police from the neighbor's phone and not be contaminated in some sort or leave behind some evidence or have evidence on him. We found no sign of any injuries. We found no sign of any blood on his person, on his shoes.
At this point in the investigation, there was nothing that we could find that was showing that Peter Visage was involved in the murder of his wife. He was in all these different places where there were surveillance cameras, and with a timeline that prevented him from being at the scene of the murder when it occurred. Now you have to start thinking, other than Peter Visage, who could do something like this, and why would they do something like this?
I asked him, did he have any concern about his own safety? If somebody came into your house, maybe they were looking for you too. Does he have any enemies? Does he owe anybody money? Does he have any illegal habits, drugs, gambling? And he answered no to all those questions. And I asked him if he knew anybody that might want to do this. And he said that she did have a boyfriend and that we should look at him. Evelyn was dating another employee of Home Depot, Mike Granda.
Here you have people going through a divorce, and now you have a boyfriend thrown into the mix.
A motive could be jealousy, could be a fight in their relationship. The fact that she still lives with Peter could be a source of upsetment for Mike Granda.
Maybe it was a jealous boyfriend who had come in there. It fit the profile for the crime scene, being that it was so horrific.
The next morning, police head to Evelyn's work to interview her boyfriend, Mike, and find that her coworkers already suspect something is wrong.
I remember I kept calling her because Evelyn was always at work by the time I got there. And she wasn't there that day. I saw detectives when they came in and I got suspicious. And I said, something happened to Evelyn, right? So the detective said to me, how would you know that? So what I said was, you just confirmed it to me.
We interviewed Evelyn's co-workers, and to a person, they all loved her and spoke highly of her. And she had some very close relationships with people that she worked with that loved her dearly, that she was good to them, they were good to her, they looked out for each other.
Evelyn was very, very loved at work. Emotionally, it was horrible. I mean, we were her friends. We were her family.
She wasn't just a friend, she was like a big sister to me.
As investigators speak with Evelyn's coworkers, her boyfriend, Mike Granda, arrives to start his shift.
When Mike Granda arrived for work, we told him that Evelyn had been murdered. He was visibly upset.
But when detectives ask Mike where he was the night before, his answer raises eyebrows.
According to Mike Granda, he had been with Evelyn the night of the murder.
At that point, you have to really look at every possibility. Maybe she was going back to her husband. Maybe she had broken up with him. Maybe it was a crime of passion. Maybe they were having a domestic argument, a dispute. We had to look at him as a possible suspect for the murder.
Police hunting the killer of Evelyn Visage are focusing in on the man she was dating while in the throes of divorcing her husband.
We did look at Evelyn's boyfriend, Mike Granda. There could be a source of jealousy based on the fact that she still lives with her husband during this process, so he has to be looked at.
Detectives bring the 28-year-old to the station for questioning.
When Michael Granda was interviewed, we asked him to describe their relationship. He said initially they were just friends, but as time went on, they became romantically involved and began dating.
Investigators press Mike for details on the night that Evelyn was killed.
According to Mike Granda, Evelyn and he had left Home Depot at approximately 3 p.m. Evelyn had gone to the Garden State Plaza Mall to return some clothes, and she actually was supposed to be having dinner with her son that night. But Peter called Evelyn and said, I'm going to my mother's house with the baby. So Evelyn called Michael saying that she was free, so she went from the shopping mall to Michael Granda's house in West New York, New Jersey.
Mike claims he and Evelyn had dinner. Around 9 p.m., Peter called to say he was on his way back with Ryan, after which Evelyn decided to head home to see her son.
Michael Granda's house is approximately a 40-minute drive to the Visage house. Michael Granda called her when she was approximately 20 minutes from home when she was on the Garden State Parkway. Approximately 40 minutes after that phone call, Evelyn was being murdered. We asked him to describe his whereabouts. He said that he had stayed home for the rest of the night, watched TV, and went to bed. So there was a window of opportunity where he did not have an alibi that could be corroborated by someone else. We subpoenaed his phone records to try to determine where he was. Michael's cell phone records indicated that his cell phone was in his apartment or very close by his apartment in West New York, New Jersey. If he were to drive from West New York, in all likelihood, he would have to pass through a toll. We subpoenaed toll records, Easy Pass records. We subpoenaed some cameras, video records from some banks in the area looking for his car passing by, and none of that was ever found. So that also led us to believe that he was telling the truth. He actually was in his home at the time that Evelyn was being murdered.
I never thought for 1 second that Mike had anything to do with it. Mike really lifted her up on a pedestal. He gave her that support that she needed. Mike made her feel beautiful.
Michael was most cooperative. He offered his phone. He offered his laptop computer. He offered samples of his blood, a buccal swab for DNA, hair. He offered everything. He said, please, I know you have to look at me, cross me off the list and find out who did this.
It just never even dawned on me that the police would look at me. I just tried to give them as much information as I could. I do remember telling them, like, oh, I know you guys have to suspect me, I told them if they wanted to search my house, they could. If they wanted to search my cars, they could. I was just very focused on trying to be helpful.
After the police obtained all the information from Mike and speaking with him and speaking with others, he was quickly ruled out as a suspect in the murder of Evelyn Visage. And there was just nothing to suggest that Peter Visage was involved. So if you don't believe the husband's involved, you don't believe the boyfriend's involved, you have to look at other individuals that may be involved.
At that point, could have been anybody. You can't make assumptions on who it could be. You have to really look at every possibility.
The day after Evelyn's murder, as police consider possible suspects, news of the crime hits the airwaves.
The Evelyn Visage murder was newsworthy just because of the area.
We're in a small town. We don't have that many murders that it's commonplace.
This was a case that really was troubling because you have a woman who was violently, brutally killed, and we couldn't figure out who did it and why they did it.
Hoping for a new lead, investigators looked to the autopsy report to learn more about the crime.
She had 2 stab wounds in her upper back area. Those were the initial strikes. And then she had a very deep slash wound to her throat. And then there were 2 stab wounds in her upper chest area, powerfully done as indicative by the fact that the knife was stuck in the floor. Based on what the medical examiner described to us, I could only imagine the sheer horror that Evelyn was experiencing.
The level of brutality that was involved in the actual murder was just shocking. Her throat was slashed almost to the point where she was decapitated. It was blood-curdling.
She must have been scared. Somebody's in her home, she's in her bedroom. Maybe it was a burglary gone bad and she came home and had startled whoever was in her house.
We circled back to examining parolees in the area, both New York and New Jersey, sex offenders, people that have committed similar crimes, burglaries gone bad or robberies gone bad. At the time of Evelyn Visage's murder, there was a group of young men who were committing robberies and burglaries in the vicinity, including a Terrence Monk, who lived approximately 5 miles from the Visage residence.
I do remember that we were having burglaries in the area, and I remember that we were having home invasions too. The name Terrence Monk, like it clicked with me.
There were cases, robberies, burglaries, and assaults where Terrence Monk committed violent acts on people that didn't cooperate. He was also implicated in a robbery probably 1.5 miles from the Visage house. It kind of lit up like a light bulb. He certainly went right up to the top of the list.
Evelyn Visage was killed in her own bedroom in a frenzied knife attack. And now, police are investigating if a violent local burglar might be responsible.
Terrence Monk was like a known criminal, and the detectives had been dealing with him for years at that point.
We had been investigating him so arduously, and for such a long time, there was not any possibility of cooperation on his behalf.
To get the information they need, investigators take a different approach.
I utilized a confidential informant to try to determine where Terrence Monk was and if in fact he was involved in this crime. He described to me where Terrence Monk was at the time that Evelyn was murdered. He told us that Terrence Monk was in Buffalo, New York, and that was substantiated by witness statements and his cell phone records.
It's another dead end for detectives. They press the informant for any other information that might help solve the case.
This young man was so plugged in the criminal community, so I asked him what the word on the street was. If it was a local guy, chances are, in the criminal community, somebody would have been talking. And he said there's nothing on the street at all. No information about who killed Evelyn Visage.
With no other leads, police re-canvass the neighborhood around the Visage home.
There was multiple attempts to locate witnesses, and detectives actually went back and conducted a road stop in the area, hoping that somebody may have seen something. Nothing was discovered, and we couldn't gain anything from that. In the village of Chestnut Ridge, it's prohibited to park a vehicle on the street at night. So we also checked to see if any parking tickets had been issued, or any vehicles parked on the street, and there were none found.
collectively, between the police and the prosecution, we were really sitting there thinking this may never get solved.
While investigators consider their next move, Evelyn's loved ones struggle to accept her loss.
I just couldn't believe that she was killed. Evelyn was such a loved person by everyone. Something like that happened to her. It makes no sense.
You know, there's some people that come into your life for a reason, a season, or a lifetime. That's what they say. There was a lot of respect and love there.
She would make like everyday fun, always laughing, having a good time. But, you know, that's life. I mean, you have to take every second you get because you never know when it's going to end.
Detectives re-interview Evelyn's friends and colleagues, hoping to uncover a tiny detail that leads them to her killer.
We did speak to many of Evelyn's friends to find out if she had a lifestyle that was potentially dangerous to her or would expose her to this type of demise.
Her life revolved around her being a mother.
She had no enemies.
Everybody that met her loved her. There was not one person that met her that did not instantly take to her. She was just a really pleasant person to be around all the time, day and night.
It was very puzzling. What happened and why was this done?
With a violent killer still on the streets, concern spreads through the community.
In this area, this little hamlet of Chestnut Ridge, it's just not that kind of an area where you would expect anything like this. People in the community are starting to get fearful.
I remember I was living alone, and I certainly had my radar up, and I was very careful coming and going, almost to the point of paranoia. I wasn't going to be a victim.
3 days after Evelyn's murder, detectives receive explosive new information, turning the investigation on its head.
Mike Granda came to the Round Pole police station with some personal items of Evelyn Visage's. Amongst those personal items, we found audio tapes and a journal that she wrote in.
Detectives immediately recognized the voices on the audio tapes as Evelyn and her husband Peter.
Evelyn apparently had secretly audio taped some of the arguments and fights that they had been having. Everything from any money that she spent, taking the car away from her, shutting off her phone. He wanted to be completely in control of Evelyn, so it was in stark contrast to what Peter described to us. The fact that Peter didn't describe any turmoil caused us to have some doubts about how truthful he was being.
Evelyn's journal contains even more startling revelations about their divorce.
He wanted custody. He was told that he wasn't going to get full custody, and he wanted the sale of the house. So if Evelyn is gone, he's got the child, he's got the sale of the house, and he can move on.
When detectives try to follow up with Peter about these revelations, they're met with silence.
At this point, Peter had retained an attorney, and we were no longer able to question him. So that again raised some suspicion. We went back and looked harder at Peter, based on the fact that he had the most to gain from Evelyn being dead.
With Peter having an ironclad alibi, investigators consider other scenarios.
Maybe he wasn't the one who actually did the murder, but you have to wonder if somehow Peter is involved in this, because it just doesn't make sense that anybody else had a reason to do this.
The suspicion is enough to get a warrant to search Peter's vehicle.
We had no idea at the time that that search of the van was about to unleash a whole new avenue of this investigation and turn this case totally upside down.
New evidence in the Evelyn Visage homicide investigation has led police to revisit her husband, Peter, as a potential suspect, and they are now searching his vehicle for any trace of incriminating evidence.
You just never know what might be that little piece. You know, whether it's a hair or a fingerprint or that one bit of DNA might be the break in the case.
Desperate for any lead in their investigation, police make a critical discovery.
There was an extensive search of Peter's van, and we uncovered in the back pocket of the middle seat of the van $3,700 in cash in a white envelope. In addition to the money that was found, there was a Sprint calling card.
This was tremendous evidence that we have just now uncovered. It offered a lot of questions.
Why would a person have $3,700 cash? We examined Peter's financial status. At the time, Peter was not very solvent in terms of having any money. Somebody who's, by all accounts, broke, and he's got $3,700 in the back of his van. And of course, we couldn't ask him why, because he had already retained counsel.
You have to now start wondering, why does this man have $3,700 in $100 bills left behind in his minivan?
It's possible that Peter may have engaged someone to kill Evelyn, and that money was going to be used to pay off the final payment.
Furthest thing from my mind was that a hitman could have been hired. That's really very rare in real life. Let's look at his bank accounts, his credit card statements, things like that, as far as getting any solid evidence he was involved in this.
We went back and looked harder at Peter's bank accounts, stock market, anything like that, in an effort to see if he had taken any money out to try to pay somebody to maybe do this, and nothing was found to be out of the ordinary or even considered to be like a payoff.
Finding no evidence Peter paid to have Evelyn killed, detectives focus on the other item found in his van.
Why would he use a calling card? Most folks, unless you don't have a cell phone or don't have a landline, don't have the necessity for a calling card. And Peter had a cell phone, he had a home phone, so we subpoenaed the records for that calling card.
There were 44 phone calls made from that prepaid phone card records beginning in November of 2002 up until the day of the murder in January of 2003.
Of 44 calls made on that card, almost all of them were made to an individual named Frank Thon.
The name is new to detectives, but when they run it through the police database, they make a telling discovery.
Police learned that Frank Thon was currently, at the time, in jail in the state of New Jersey.
This is a man who's been arrested numerous times, assaults, violent assaults. His most recent arrest was for driving while intoxicated. The officer found a loaded handgun underneath the armrest of the truck and hollow point bullets. At the time of the murder, he was on intensive supervised parole. Shortly after the Visage homicide, Frank Thon turned himself in to serve a year in the county jail.
Could there be an innocent explanation why Peter called a known violent criminal for months leading up to the murder, only to stop the day Evelyn was killed?
We subpoenaed Frank Thon's phone records. Analyzing his phone records, we found that he was in the vicinity of the Visage home on January 6th, the day before the murder, and on January 7th, the day of the murder. Then it became really evident to us that he was involved in this.
So now things are starting to click. We were able to secure a search warrant to search Frank Thon's apartment. And one of the things that the police recovered was a computer. Upon forensic investigation of that computer, we found that Frank Thon had searched directions from his apartment to the Visage home.
The evidence is compelling, but investigators need something more concrete to lay charges.
Based on the evidence that we had, it still was a very weak case. We don't have any forensic evidence that would connect him to the murder of Evelyn Visage.
You need the probable cause, you need the connection to prove your case and to actually have it stick.
With little else to go on, detectives make a bold decision.
We had no other option other than to go at Frank Thon. We knew our case would depend upon Frank Thon making a confession.
This was really the one shot that the police had to solve this case. It was a huge gamble because if he decided to ask for a lawyer, they could not question him anymore. If he denied it, they were stuck with what he had to say.
Police can only hope that Frank reveals the truth of whether Peter was involved in the murder.
We don't have a case against Peter. We're getting closer to figuring out maybe what occurred, but again, it doesn't prove that Peter Visage had any relationship to this murder.
We had nothing other than just the fact that Peter is calling Frank Thon. This case is going to rise and fall, whether we succeed or not with an interview.
Investigators head to the county jail to confront the hardened criminal.
I specifically requested a small room where we could have the table against the wall, and we deliberately set that room up to increase Frank Thon's anxiety. We had lawyer boxes with Evelyn Visich's name on the boxes. We had maps with pins in them. The small office was full of, as I call it, a number of props.
With everything in place, police bring in 41-year-old Frank Thon.
They took the handcuffs off him, and we pretty much just stared at him for like a good minute or two, again in an attempt to increase his anxiety. And he was visibly nervous. And I said to him, I said, I don't want to hear what you have to say. I already know what happened, and I'm going to prove it. And I'm going to tell you what, a murder for hire in New York, you could potentially face the death penalty. We told him that we had all types of evidence implicating him, and his face hit the table. He's perspiring heavily. His heart rate was obviously increased. I could see the vein in his neck beating. And I said to him, I said, you don't have any friends in this world right now. I said, if you tell us the truth, we'll try to assist you in getting the best possible deal. There was a long pause. He took a big sigh, and then he began to tell us what happened.
Four weeks after the murder of Evelyn Visich, investigators have just convinced suspected hitman Frank Thon to start talking.
He almost had a look of detachment from what was going on. He took a big sigh and he says, all right, I'll tell you guys what happened. Frank Thon told us that he was the person who killed Evelyn.
Frank Thon confessed not only to the murder of Evelyn Visich, but that he was hired by her husband, Peter.
I really was surprised after everything was said and done, after all of the investigative leads, that it all came back to Peter.
Frank tells detectives that he was introduced to Peter 3 months ago through a mutual acquaintance.
Peter asked this gentleman if he knew of anybody that could take care of his wife. Frank Thon requested $10,000 cash, with $5,000 being paid up front. We later learned that Peter obtained money from a friend of a friend on a loan. A short time after that, Peter Visich met Frank Thon at a pizzeria where Peter gave Frank the down payment of $5,000 cash. I looked at the money found in the van as this could have been the final payment.
To hear that for such a small amount of money that somebody was willing to go out there and kill someone, I was shocked and disgusted.
In his confession, Frank describes Peter's impatience to have Evelyn killed.
He told me that he had a second envelope ready. He was really pushing it.
Peter Visich was pestering him to get this done, so he decided January 7th was going to be the night.
Frank meets Peter at the Visich home the day before the murder.
He told me to lay out of the house and I'd be able to walk to the back of the house and he would leave a door unlocked for me.
Peter told Frank that he would leave the back door open, and he gave Evelyn's schedule for that day.
The next day, Peter establishes his alibi.
He went to his mother's house and then the shopping mall and then stopping to get milk. He knows that there's video cameras. He knows that he's going to get a receipt. That's all adding time to his alibi that can also be substantiated.
After sunset, Frank enters the Visich house and removes the light bulbs to lie in wait for Evelyn in the dark.
Garage door open. Then I heard the house door open. Then I heard her coming up the stairs, and that's when I came out of the room.
He had a gun. He pushed her into the bedroom, had her kneel on the bed, and he told her he was merely here to do a robbery and he wasn't going to hurt her. He said he then took a knife that he had brought with him and stabbed her twice in the back.
She dropped to her knees from the bed. She slid down. And now what do you do? I took her by the forehead from behind her. I sliced in, then I sliced back. I heard her bleed. Scratched the bone. I recognized the sound. She dropped immediately to my right on the floor. I heard the air leaving her body. I stabbed her 2 or 3 more times in the chest.
Do you leave the knife behind?
Yes, I did.
Where did you leave it?
Stuck in the chest.
Frank Thon was the instrument of Evelyn's death. But Peter Visich brought that instrument into his own home.
On Valentine's Day, 2003, a warrant was issued for the arrest of Peter Visich.
Police rushed to take Peter into custody.
I said, Peter, I have very good news for you. He said, what's that? He was somewhat befuddled. I said, we found out who killed your wife. And he became like almost giggly. He's like, really, who? I said, you did, expletive. You're under arrest.
It angers me and it pains me to think that the person that she married was the one that did that to her. It's shocking. It's sad.
I was very surprised. Like, I was shocked. All of us were.
He went through this elaborate murder, and I just thought, like, how pathetic are you as a person?
Frank Thon pleads guilty for his role in the murder of Evelyn.
In exchange for his cooperation, he was promised a sentence of 20 years to life if he testified truthfully at the trial of Peter Visich.
In November of 2003, in front of a packed courtroom, Peter stands trial for plotting to murder Evelyn.
Evelyn's friends and family were throughout the trial present. They had to endure really gut-wrenching testimony, particularly when Frank Thon testified.
He said that he told her at the end, I'm going to put you out of your misery. And your husband was the one that hired me. She was just in shock.
Peter Visich never takes the stand during the 8-day trial.
He showed no emotion the whole entire trial.
I would look at him and then just think to myself, like, why you had to get to that point? Why did you do it?
After hearing the evidence, the jury deliberates for only 3 hours.
The jurors announced that they did have a unanimous verdict, guilty on each and every count, including murder in the first degree, which carried a life without parole sentence.
We all screamed. We were relieved, and we felt like justice had been served, although it was bittersweet.
It's just so hard to comprehend why. Now the child doesn't have a mom or dad.
What he did to Ryan is just as unforgivable as what he did to Evelyn, because he deprived Ryan of one of the most incredible human beings I've ever met in my life. I've never met anyone like Evelyn.
For those closest to Evelyn, she remains alive in their hearts.
Evelyn is still here with us. She's still in our spirit. She was full of love. She was full of life. She was the life of the party.
She was always happy. And if you weren't happy next to her, she would have made you happy. She was a good soul. She was a good person. She will always be missed.
A cherished family at the center of a small town.
They laughed and they joked around and they were happy together. They were loved and well respected in our community.
Is gunned down in cold blood.
I'll never forget walking in the house that morning and seeing what I saw. Who could have done this? Was it somebody that they knew? Maybe this person had sought some type of revenge.
Detectives pursue a trail of suspects.
He was actually set to gain from the death.
And then his behavior was alarming.
During the polygraph, he started tearing the stuff off. I know they had issues within their relationship.
They said, well, I can take care of that problem for the right sum of money.
But the killer remains elusive.
What are we missing? What are we not doing?
Until a shocking confession reveals the true culprit.
Then she agreed to wear a recording device and elicit some more information. I mean, it was just incredible. It was disturbing.
The killer was about the most unexpected thing. It was such a shock.
Columbia, Kentucky is a small but tight-knit rural community.
Everyone knows everyone else. Your neighbors feel like family. People watch out for one another.
Not uncommon, you'll be walking downtown, you'll stop, run into friends or family. Very friendly atmosphere.
One of the most beloved families in Columbia are the Wellnitzes. They own a veterinary clinic just steps away from their home.
I just remember that environment at the clinic was a place that I, as a kid, wanted to spend every spare moment that I had, just because it was a great place to be. Joe and Beth, their kids, Dennis and Meg, they were kind, they were loving, and they were fun to be around.
On February 26, 1993, the town forever changes after two of Joe and Beth's employees make a grim discovery just after 8 a.m. at the Wellnitz home.
Two employees had shown up for work, but Joe and Beth were not at the clinic. The clinic was adjacent to the residence. So the gentleman walked over to the house, went in the back door, and discovered Joe's body in the downstairs area of the home. The lady that had also shown up for work that morning, she then went to the house, discovered two bodies upstairs.
Joe and Beth and their son, Dennis, they've been shot. Then she ran out and called the police.
Investigators rushed to the scene.
I'll never forget walking in the house that morning and seeing what I saw. It was just total shock. I knew what kind of people they were. I knew how kind they were and how compassionate they were with their work that they did. I couldn't believe it. When we entered the house, there was Joe laying there on the floor. He was on his stomach. His hand was underneath his chest.
He had a pair of gray sweatpants on and a white t-shirt. It looked like he came out of a bathroom and had been shot and fell face first. Blood that had pooled around the body.
My initial reaction was shock. But then I realized shortly thereafter that I had a job to do, and my job was to take care of the scene, to see if we could find out who did this horrible thing. Around the scene where Joe was found, there was multiple shell casings, and you could see bullet holes in the walls. We went from there to the upstairs, and we found Dennis's body laying there in his bedroom. He had no shirt on. You could see bullet holes in his back. There was also shell casings laying around. Looked like he was crawling on the floor and was executed by the killer at that point. Entering into the back bedroom that belonged to Joe and Beth, you could see multiple shell casings back there.
Beth was found on the side of the bed nearest to the doorway. She appeared to have been standing when she was shot, with multiple gunshot wounds to her head and upper torso. The Wellnitzes were all found either in or near a bed or in clothes that suggested they had been sleeping. So it was apparent that it had happened during the night at some point or early morning hours.
After examining the bodies, police scour the rest of the house for clues, but there's no sign of a murder weapon.
There were no broken windows, there was no furniture turned over, the house had not been ransacked. It was significant that there was no forced entry, that at least gave the impression that it was somebody with some degree of familiarity with the home and with the Wellnitz family. It appeared this family had been targeted.
Who could have done this? Who is the person that would have done such a horrible crime in this community that is usually so gentle? Was it somebody that they knew? Maybe this person had sought some type of revenge. Once we saw that these three people had been murdered, we immediately wanted to know, where is Meg Wellnitz at, so we can find her to make sure she's safe, first of all, make sure she's not a victim. We were able to locate her. She was at school in Lexington and was unharmed.
officers are tasked with breaking the news to Joe and Beth's daughter.
Meg was told that her mom and dad and brother were murdered, were dead. I really felt sorry for her. I thought, now how is she going to go on? You know, how did she recover from this?
We got a phone call just a little while after I got up, and they said Beth and Joe have been killed. And at that moment, we didn't know Dennis also had been killed. And I just stayed in my room that day and just cried. Just couldn't believe that they were gone. They were like a second set of parents for me.
One of my family members had called. They gave me the horrible news that Joe and Beth and Dennis had all been murdered. And that's a day you don't forget.
Joe Welnitz was born in 1942 and grew up in Louisville, Kentucky. From a young age, he always loved animals and turned that passion into a career.
Not many rural communities anywhere would have been able to boast of having a veterinarian with the background that Joe had. Joe was one of the most caring, kindest gentlemen that you will ever meet.
In his 30s, Joe met Beth Preston, a woman 10 years his junior. Both divorced, they married in 1979, and Joe adopted her 2 kids, Dennis and Meg. 2 years later, they moved their family and Joe's clinic from Lexington to Columbia.
Meg would come in and out of the clinic. Dennis would I would just see him outside. He was only 20 years old.
Dennis was popular in school. He had worked in town. He had attended college. He was just a well-liked young man.
Beth was the one I was closest to. She was the face of the clinic. She was the person everyone saw when they walked in the door. Always had a smile on her face. The relationship between Joe and Beth was perfect to me. They laughed and they joked around and they were happy together. They were a very happy family.
But one horrific night has changed everything. Who could have wanted to kill the Welnitzes, and why?
The 2 employees that discovered the bodies were certainly interviewed that morning. There was really no motive, and the way the 2 of them arrived that morning, there was really no opportunity for either of them to commit the murders. They were dismissed as suspects.
In Lexington, police asked Meg to help them piece together her family's last movements. She says she visited them for dinner 2 days ago, but had returned that night as she had school.
Meg told the police that she'd been in Lexington the night before the bodies were found, and that she'd been playing cards with some friends, her boyfriend, as well as another couple, Bill Meese, and then Bill Meese's wife.
When asked if Meg was aware of any problems at home, she gives police their first lead.
There was a couple that were tenants of Joe and Bess they may have had issues with, and their names Brenda and Dave Cowell.
The Cowells had been living in a cabin on the Welnitz property.
They were living there rent-free, exchanged for doing some work for Joe and Beth. There was some discrepancy there about whether they were doing the work sufficiently or not. Joe and Beth felt like they weren't, so they gave them a bill for $1,800 for the rent. And ultimately, they never paid it. They filed bankruptcy.
Were the Cowells angry enough to want the Welnitzes dead? Was this murder payback?
They were persons of interest, people that we needed to talk to. We needed to prove or disprove whether they were involved in it or not.
Coming up, fear races through the community.
We thought if this could happen to the Welnitzes, it could happen to any of us. Who would be next? People were scared. Everybody wanted to know who did it, why they did it, and how they did it.
Everybody was just guessing, gossiping.
And police unearthed family secrets, indicating a potential motive.
It was a surprise to me to learn that there was another child involved. There was actually a will giving him so much money out of the estate.
Before a shocking confession.
I walked through the house, I engaged in firearm, and he said magazine of weapons.
Reveals a killer no one could have imagined.
It was a bombshell. Couldn't believe it.
Police investigating the homicide of Joe, Beth, and Dennis Wellnitz have their first suspects, tenants who had recently clashed with the family over money.
When we learned about the bankruptcy, about them living on the property, this discrepancy about the work they were doing, whether it was sufficient or not, especially when it came to the money, and then this bill for $1,800, we thought, well, this could be a motive for them wanting to do something. We knew that we had to talk to them. We had to see if they were involved.
Police learned the Cowles no longer live on the Wellnitz property.
Maybe they left there disgruntled. We went on that theory. Maybe they had went to the Wellnitz house that morning and then got into it with them, and then that's when all this escalated from there.
While detectives tracked down the Cowles, officers canvassed the area for witnesses.
We did a neighborhood canvass to talk to people to see if anybody in that area had heard anything, seen anything, or had any other information that they could provide. We were not able to identify anybody that did hear anything that went on that night during the shooting or anything.
4 days after the murder, detectives locate the Cowles and bring them in for separate interviews. Brenda claims she didn't hold any grudge against the Wellnitzes.
She told us that even though they had not paid the money that Joe and Beth felt like they owed, they had worked out the discrepancy and everything had moved on from that.
Police asked Brenda where she was the night of the murder.
They ended up moving off the farm. She said she was not there. She was at home when it happened.
When detectives speak with Brenda's husband, Dave, he's unable to confirm her alibi because of his own.
Dave was working in Louisville, Kentucky, which is almost in Indiana, probably 100 miles from where this happened at. He adamantly denied any involvement in this. He didn't want it to do harm to them.
Investigators speak to friends of the Wellnitzes to confirm the dispute with the Cowles had been resolved.
We were talking to friends in that area. We were able to determine that situation where those hard feelings had been resolved a long time prior to this happening. They were ruled out as far as having anything to do with this murder.
With no arrests made, fear begins to grip the town.
We thought if this could happen to the Wellnitzes, it could happen to any of us. It could happen to anyone. They were loved and well respected in our community, and so if they could be killed, who would be next? People were scared. Everybody wanted to know who did it, why they did it, and how they did it.
Word travels fast. Everybody was expressing their opinion as to what may or may not have contributed to this. But everybody was just guessing, gossiping.
It's got the whole community in an uproar about what happened. We had to get some answers pretty quickly, make sure that it wasn't some random killing and that other people may be coming next. When we started thinking about who could have done this, we started thinking about the veterinary business. People get very sensitive about their pets, so we thought, well, maybe somebody had gotten disgruntled over that. We learned from the employees there that there was an issue between Jerry Yarberry and the Wellnesses, where he had brought in his dog to have treatment done to its eye, and the dog ultimately was blind. So we thought, well, maybe this might be a motive for somebody to do harm to them. Some of the key questions that we wanted to know from Jerry was, how did he feel now toward the Wellnesses, and how did he feel toward what had happened between them?
Police bring Jerry into the station for questioning.
He told us that he was very upset about his pet. He refused to pay the bill that was owed to the Wellnesses. They ended up having to file a lawsuit against him in order to recoup the funds.
While Jerry admits he was angry with Joe, he says he isn't a killer.
He adamantly denied doing anything to the Wellnesses as far as going to that extreme. When we talked to Jerry, we learned that he was home watching TV with his wife and kids, and we were able to confirm that that's where he was at, and therefore we were able to eliminate him as a suspect in this case.
There's frustration on the part of the police because they want to see a crime solved. They want to see a murderer, in this case, held accountable. They want to see that person punished. And then there's frustration because we don't know if justice is ever going to be served.
As the case threatens to stall, a friend of the Wellnitz family contacts police with pertinent information.
I said, I'm a real estate broker, and our getting the property ready to sell, there was an indenture, kind of a rectangle, in the floor of that master bedroom closet. I knew for a fact Joe and them kept a floor safe upstairs in their bedroom in the closet. I'm assuming, but that's where he kept all these important papers, his deed, anything that was of significance.
Gives you the opinion that the safe was part of the plan all along, that the killer knew where that safe was at. It was not setting out in the open where you would commit these 3 murders and then say, okay, there's a safe, I'm going to take that with me. It was hidden back in a closet.
It certainly caused the officers to focus their attention on who would want that safe, who would know the safe was there, and who would stand to have some benefit from removing the safe, especially in light of the fact that nothing else was taken, nothing else was disturbed.
If we could locate that safe, and very easily, that's going to put us on the trail of whoever committed this crime.
Police investigating the first triple homicide in Columbia, Kentucky, are searching for an object stolen from the scene they hope will lead them to the killer.
The missing fire safe was certainly a critical piece of evidence that the officers were investigating. They tried to determine more specifically what the contents of the safe were, what was in there, what was going to perhaps turn up that might then be a clue.
In talking to the family, we were able to learn that there was possibly could be insurance papers in that safe, maybe even up to around $1,000.
In this case, the only motive was to either cause the death of the Wellnitz family or to take the safe out.
As detectives put out an APB for the safe, the autopsy results come in.
One of the crucial things that we need to know is the time of death.
As far as the time frame of the death, the internal examination of the bodies was consistent that they had been killed within a few hours prior to the bodies being discovered.
It's estimated Joe, Beth, and Dennis were murdered around 4 a.m.
The medical examiner was able to determine that each victim died as a result of multiple gunshot wounds.
None of the victims had defense marks on their bodies, meaning they had likely been taken by surprise.
Additional projectiles were recovered from the bodies during the autopsy. The firearms examiner did determine that all of the shots were fired from a 9mm handgun. It did seem likely that they were all fired by the same person, given the fact that they were all fired from the same gun.
Obviously, from there, we're going to start doing multiple interviews to try to eliminate or show who has killed these 3 people. Who could have that much of a grudge against them. During our investigation, we were able to learn that Joe had another son by the name of Eric. From my previous personal experience with Joe and Beth, I didn't know about Eric until after the murder. Joe had adopted him much the way that he did with Meg and Dennis, and then that marriage broke apart. It was a surprise to me to learn that there was another child involved that Joe had adopted at a young age. We started receiving information, documentation showing that Eric was actually still set to gain from the death of Joe. There was actually a will giving him so much money out of the estate to the tune of $250,000. Eric was somebody that we needed to talk to because that much money obviously would be a motive for somebody to do something like this.
Police tracked the 19-year-old down at his home in Lexington.
When Eric was interviewed, he was shocked that it occurred. They had issues within their relationship, him and Joe. It was a very distant relationship and then non-existent after a while. Eric also indicated that he felt like he was replaced by Dennis. They had completely become estranged after so long and had stopped any contact with each other. One of the things that we learned was that Eric did resent Joe. Part of that resentment was because of this estrangement.
Had Eric settled a score and inherited a fortune by killing the family? When police question him about the will, they are taken aback by his response.
When he learned that he was a beneficiary to this will, he was actually surprised that he was included in it, because of they've been estranged for that many years.
But detectives can't just take Eric at his word.
The motive is there, the possibility, so we needed to know whether he had any type of alibi that we could substantiate to make sure that he wasn't in Columbia that morning. We learned during our interview with Eric Wellness that he had worked that night, and then once he got off work, he went to a friend's house and slept at that friend's house.
Eric says he was in Lexington the entire night, 2 hours away from Columbia.
So we were able to talk to that friend and determine that he did not have the opportunity to commit this crime. We felt pretty certain that he was not a suspect at this point. We eliminated him and moved on.
I was shocked, and it was an odd situation being questioned by the police officers. The fact that I was named in the will, if that was something that I had known, then that for sure gives me a motive. But there's no way in the world I could have ever done anything like that. Yes, I was angry as a child, having your dad disappearing out of your life, kind of in a snap of a finger. It was hard, and I was angry, but not that kind of anger where I wished anything bad.
Detectives learn that Meg, the only other surviving member of the family, is also named in the will. Could she have anything to do with the murder?
I really felt bad for Meg at that time because I knew Meg, but we had to get some answers. When we approached her about the will, she didn't know about it. She also wanted answers, She loved them, Joe and Beth and Dennis.
She was so bright and intelligent and loving.
Police ask Meg about her relationship with her parents. She says it was good, but she raises one concern.
Officers did learn that Beth and Meg had some disagreements over some of the people that she was now spending a lot of time with.
One person in particular, Meg's boyfriend, Randy Appleton.
Beth and Joe didn't want him around, so we needed to talk to Randy. Randy became a viable person of interest.
After 3 members of the Wellnitz family are gunned down in their own home, police now have a new suspect, the boyfriend of surviving daughter Meg, 20-year-old Randy Appleton.
Joe didn't go into any details, but he had a concern, I think, of the direction that Meg had taken as far as who she was associating with.
That could be a motive for Randy Appleton.
Detectives ask Randy where he was the night of the murder.
He was leery about talking to us.
Randy tells police he was playing cards with Meg and her friends until 2 a.m. the night of the murder. Then he mentions something that grabs detectives' attention.
We learned that he was interested in firearms. We had learned that he had frequented a firing range.
If the murder weapon had been used at the same firing range where he in fact acknowledged having been practicing with a 9mm, would be a very critical part of the investigation if those shell casings collected from the range matched the murder weapon that was believed to have been used to kill the Wellnitz family.
We're starting to see red flags at this point. Randy was one that liked guns. He did like to go to that firing range and did use a weapon there. We actually ended up going to the firing range and collecting several spent shell casings. All of them were submitted to the crime lab. Our hope was that we could match those rounds through the laboratory to some of the 9mm shell casings that we had located.
2 weeks later, police received the results on the shell casings.
They were not able to find any casings that matched as having been fired from the murder weapon that was used to kill the Wellnitz family.
It was very disappointing that we were unable to tie any of those shell casings to Randy Appleton.
It suggested either that they used a different weapon at the firing range than was used to murder the family, or that it could have been somebody else.
Despite the setback, Randy's love of guns and familiarity with the Wellnitz home means he is still a suspect. Police look to confirm his alibi with those he and Meg claim to have been with the night of the murder, Bill and Regina Meese.
We had to talk to them to see if that was what they were doing, playing cards during the early morning hours, because that was Randy's alibi. Bill was cooperative, where Bill had agreed to talk to us about certain things.
Bill corroborates Randy's alibi.
They were all four together playing cards till the early morning hours. He agreed to take a lie detector test. During the process of the polygraph examiner asked him if he knew anything about what happened, if he had any involvement about what happened.
And then his behavior was something that was alarming. It was something that caused some concern with the officers.
He started tearing the stuff off that you put on during a polygraph and just shut it down right then. And then the polygraph was over at that point. So he did not complete the polygraph. He was just very mad. Definitely raised red flags with us that he knows more than he's telling us, and that he's afraid of that polygraph because that polygraph might tell us more than he wants us to know.
Despite his behavior, police have nothing concrete on Bill and are forced to let him go.
We tried to talk to Regina, but Bill did not want us to interview her. He would get very controlling with her. It's over at this point. We were still running down leads. Obviously, you always get leads that you're going to follow. But one of the things that I thought early on was, if we ever get to a point where Regina and Bill are not talking, we need to go back and reapproach her.
Lacking any new developments, months turn into years, leaving detectives and the Wellnitz's loved ones frustrated.
What are we missing? What are we not doing? They're friends of mine, and this was one of those cases that you want to solve before your career is over. It was just like you were at a dead end, and we couldn't figure that out,
When the case went cold, it was very disheartening just knowing that someone had committed this terrible crime and that they may possibly never have to pay for that. I just remember feeling so sad. Beth and Joe were just such a light in our community.
You don't have any answers when it happened. Had no idea of who could have done it or why they would have done it. There was so little information coming out, it just kind of fell to the wayside. It's just sad.
The case remains cold for nearly a decade. But in 2002, detectives decide to take a fresh look at the triple homicide.
This case is still on my mind. I had never forgot it. And I said, okay, what's the condition or what's the status of Bill and Regina? And I learned at that point that they were separated. That was the thing that we were waiting on before, is when this separation occurred, to go see what Regina had to say outside of the control of Bill Meese.
Police track Regina down, and what she has to tell them is shocking.
When we met with Regina in Lexington, she told us that she had proof of who killed the Wellnitzes.
Nine years after the murder of Joe and Beth Wellnitz and their son Dennis, police finally have a break in the case. One of their surviving daughter Meg's best friends, Regina Meese, says she knows who the killer is and has proof.
When we approached her, she immediately said, "I've got this piece of evidence." She essentially wanted some assurance that she wouldn't be charged with tampering with evidence. And I assured her that if she in fact turned it over to law enforcement, I didn't think it would even constitute a crime. At that time, we didn't know if she had photographs that perhaps were taken during the commission of the crime. We didn't know if she may have had the firearm that was used in the commission of the crime, or what piece of evidence that she had. But she shared with us that she had, in fact, retained possession of the fire safe that had been removed from the back closet in the bedroom upstairs of Beth and Joe's home.
When police ask Regina how she got the safe, she says the person who gave it to her is the one who shot the Wellnitzes.
Regina's the one started the ball rolling. Everything started to fall in place. Regina told us that Bill Meese was the one responsible for the death of Dennis and the death of Joe and Beth Wellnitz. It was very shocking, very shocking.
She had been interviewed by the police before, but had been told by her then husband, now ex-husband, not to talk to the police, not to tell them anything. And it certainly appeared, at least, to be a burden lifted that she was able to share this information.
It was a huge deal when we heard what she had to say. That was the part that we needed to happen, and that from there on it steamrolled from there.
Regina takes police to her home to see the fire safe.
It was the same type and everything that we were missing from the house that night. It was the same measurements, that same dimensions that we had measured when we were in the Wellness house and discovered that the safe was missing.
When we later compared the bottom impressions on that fire safe to the imprints taken from the closet, it was a perfect match, and in fact it was the fire safe that was stolen from the Wellness home.
Nothing of significant value is found in the safe, but Regina delivers another explosive revelation to police. She tells them that Bill is planning to kill again.
Interviewing Bill Meese's ex-wife, it came to the attention of the police that a mutual friend had had an encounter with Bill Meese where he had offered to kill her boyfriend.
Bill had told her that he would commit this murder for her for $500.
I mean, it was just incredible. It was disturbing.
Was Bill some kind of twisted serial murderer? Police decide to move before he can strike once more.
We initiated this investigation and contacted that lady that Bill had approached.
She agreed to wear a recording device, speak with Bill Meese. He was provided a certain sum of money as a down payment, and the police then arrested him for offering to kill this mutual friend's boyfriend.
With Bill in jail, police question him about the Wellnitz triple homicide.
There was no statements made about the Wellnitz murder that he was willing to make at that time.
When we interviewed him there, I mean, we did not get a confession from him. He denied it at that point. Even though we knew that we were on the right track, it still takes evidence to put this together.
As detectives work on building their case with Bill still in custody, news spreads quickly about his arrest and possible involvement in the shooting of Joe, Beth, and Dennis.
When I first heard about Bill being a suspect, it sent shivers up my spine because I immediately am flooded with the memories of being in junior high with Bill and having very, very strange interactions with him. I was 13, 14 years old. He at one point stabbed me in the leg with a pencil. He had been open about talking about murder and proceeded to threaten me that if I said anything about it that he'd kill me and my family. I hadn't seen my dad in years when I went to school with Bill. I don't know how they knew each other.
One question remains for police. If Bill murdered the Wellnitzes, what was his motive? Detectives learn another piece of shocking information when Regina tells them Bill might have pulled the trigger, but someone else masterminded the killings.
She did share with us that Meg had been involved in the planning of this murder and that she had wanted it done. Certainly that was shocking to everybody. She said that Meg had ridden with Bill Meese from Lexington down to Columbia late night, early morning when these murders occurred.
Meg was a big part of the planning and execution of the plan at her parents' house. What we also learned is that they had been planning this 3 months prior to the murders, before they did it. We believed at this time that Meg and Bill Meese were the ones responsible for the murders. We had ruled out Regina and Randy Appleton at this time. It was a bombshell for us to learn that information. I couldn't believe it. Totally unexpected.
10 years after Joe, Beth, and Dennis Wellnitz were shot in cold blood, police now believe Meg Wellnitz wanted her parents dead and asked her friend Bill Meese to kill them.
Based upon my prior history with Meg Wellnitz, I would have never dreamed that she would have been involved in that murder of her parents and sibling. She had become that type of person, not the one that I knew from before. And now all of a sudden I see her in a completely different light when she has no compassion for life.
Before they can lay charges, detectives need hard evidence against Meg and Bill.
One of the things that we learned during the investigation, they had purchased a 9mm high-power Browning automatic. We knew they had done that. They used a false ID, and they used it to make the purchase of the gun. We were able to learn that through a report from ATF, and we actually identified who sold that gun to them, and that the person that sold it to them actually identified Meg and Bill as being the ones that came in.
On February 27, 2003, detectives finally have the evidence they need.
This case was presented to an Adair County grand jury, and the grand jury indicted both Meg Wellnitz and Bill Meese.
Meg is arrested at her home in Lexington, but refuses to speak to police. Bill, who is serving a 12-year sentence for the murder for hire plot, is ready to talk.
During his statement, he certainly indicated to us Meg Wellnitz was involved in the planning. This was done at her urging. This was her idea, and that she wanted it done.
We agreed that she wanted to have her parents killed. She claimed the estate was worth $1 million. She would give me 10% of that estate in exchange for killing her parents.
We had the motivation being money. What we learned was that Meg and Bill drove from Lexington that morning down to Columbia, and that Meg gave Bill the key to the front door. She stays in the car. She does not go into the house.
I walked through the house to the back room, showed him out of the back room. I engaged him, fired on him. He came toward me and I continued firing. He fell. I went upstairs, into the hall. Elizabeth was standing next to her bed. I engaged and fired on her. She fell. I came back down the hall. I entered Dennis's room. He was sitting on his bed. I engaged him. I emptied the magazine of weapons. He was still sitting up at that time. He broke my gun before he got on the floor and shot him. I then went into the back bedroom and into the closet. I got the firebox, took the box down in the car, took off the clothes I was wearing. I put all those items, as well as firearm, 3 magazines, in a black plastic trash bag. I put the black trash bag in the trash container and drove back to that. We got back to Lexington about 6:30 or 7:30.
It truly was a chilling account of just how cold-hearted he was, not only in doing it, but in talking about it.
Police confront Meg with Bill's confession.
She agreed to then give a statement. When we met with Meg, my observation and my perception of her demeanor and her statements to us certainly was not one of any remorse. It was a matter-of-fact description of what she had done some years prior in having her family killed.
I don't think I could have ever thought of Meg committing a murder or being a part of a murder plan. I know that life insurance might seem like a lot of money, but when you put that cost on lives, it's nothing. Like it's unfathomable to think that she considered their lives that invaluable.
Bill Meese was convicted by a jury of 3 counts of murder, robbery, and burglary, and he was sentenced to death. Meg Wellnitz was convicted of complicity to 3 counts of murder, complicity to robbery, and complicity to burglary, and she received a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole for at least 25 years.
It's very disturbing to know that this little sweet girl that I remember has been the one that actually played such a big role in this murder. Meg orchestrated one of the most horrendous crimes that you could imagine, killing your mom and dad and also your brother.
I do not think that Meg receiving 25 years was a just sentence. I think she was as guilty as Bill Meese, and I think she should have been given the same type of sentence as Bill Meese, death.
For their daughter to have been the killer was about the most unexpected thing. It was such a shock to try to wrap your head around how could a daughter carry out or be the mastermind. It does not get any more heartless than that, and it does not get any more sickening than that. She didn't deserve to ever be free again.
In 2014, having served 8 years of her life sentence, Meg is found dead in her cell of an apparent suicide.
I certainly could never have imagined that things would have turned out this way. I just feel sad that Joe wasn't able to live out his life the way that he deserved to and continue to give back to the community that he was a part of, and be a father to Dennis and to Meg even. I wish I had gotten to spend more time with him.
It's just hard to understand sometimes why things happen and why they had to lose their lives in that way when they had so much ahead of them. It was a very tragic ending.
The community lost a cherished family. I mean, we miss them as friends. We miss them as part of the community. They were just fine folks.
A loving mother with a selfless spirit.
I remember her laughter. You could hear Mother laughing from 2 rooms away. She was really representative of the goodness in people. She loved her community. They loved her.
Is stabbed to death in a horrifying attack.
It was a gruesome crime scene. There was a lot of blood.
The perpetrator left the victim with a 2-pronged serving fork sticking out of her throat.
The amount of devastation led us to believe that it definitely was a crime of passion.
Suspicion falls on those closest to her.
He was the husband that last saw her alive. He didn't really show any signs of grieving.
He failed the polygraph.
My first thought was that it was a domestic assault.
Her son had an argument with his mother that morning.
A neighbor had seen a teenager running away from the home that day.
Months go by without an arrest.
We kept wondering, why is it so hard to capture a murderer in this small town?
Then, just as the case is in danger of going cold, police uncover a dire warning.
The note threatened more violence
that leads to a deranged killer no one could have predicted.
Wow, we didn't see that coming.
Shenandoah, Iowa is a close-knit farming community home to just 5,500 people.
Shenandoah is your typical small town. It's just beautiful. The corn surrounding the towns. Everybody knows one another. You just are almost shocked at how nice folks are.
It's a small, peaceful community. People know their neighbors, take care of each other. You don't have a lot of violent crime of any nature.
The peace is shattered on September 6, 1988, when police get a disturbing call from local pastor Robert Borton at 3:40 p.m. He tells police his wife of 19 years, Cindy, is dead.
He found her body in the kitchen, lying in a pool of her own blood. He called authorities, who arrived immediately and kept him outside of the house.
It was gruesome crime scene. We found a female on the kitchen floor. There was a lot of blood everywhere. This person had been stabbed many, many times.
The perpetrator left the victim lying on her back in a pool of blood with a two-pronged serving fork sticking out of her throat. That image stayed with me because it was remarkable in its gruesomeness. There were 4 instruments that appeared to come from her kitchen that were weapons of convenience for the killer.
There were 2 forks, a large 2-pronged fork, a 4-pronged fork, as well as 2 knives. There was a struggle. There were some cuts on her hand where she had fought the person and she had tried to get away from the person. The phone had been ripped off of the wall, and it was obvious that a lot of activity went on while Cindy was being killed.
Detectives observed that the pool of blood is not yet dry, meaning the murder likely happened in the late morning or early afternoon.
In addition to the blood in the kitchen, there were also some blood stains found in the bathroom.
It was obvious that the person had cleaned up in the bathroom because there wasn't any visible pools of blood, just blood that looked like it had been washed off of hands or clothing. We did not have the benefit of DNA testing back in the 80s. Blood would have been collected still because you can type the blood, and that was what was one thing that we'd be looking at. And of course, fingerprints obviously throughout the crime scene.
There was no forced entry. We were 99% sure that she knew who the perpetrator was. My first thought was that it was a family assault.
The amount of devastation that was there at the crime scene led us to believe that it definitely was a crime of passion.
Detectives had to speak with Cindy's husband, Robert, but are beaten to it by a new arrival at the scene, the couple's 18-year-old son.
I seen an ambulance parked in front of my house, and my father was leaning against the front of my mother's car crying, and I just knew deep down inside me that my world was never going to be the same. I dropped my backpack there in the middle of the yard and went running up to my father, and he then informed me that Mama was gone.
39-year-old Cynthia Borton was a born and bred Iowa girl. She and her brother were raised by loving parents just outside Des Moines.
My mother and my uncle would always tell me about the adventures that they had around the farm. Life was good for them. Everybody had to laugh, according to Mama. I remember her laughter. You could hear Mother laughing from 2 rooms away. You would have to rush in there to find out what it was that was so funny that made Mama laugh.
As a teen, Cindy worked at a local restaurant and soon after would meet her future husband.
My father wound up coming in there and doing the whole phone number exchange thing, and then they started going out, and one thing led to another.
The couple married in 1969. When the family moved to Shenandoah, Cindy had her hands full.
Mama just kind of assumed the role of the pastor's wife. She also worked at a donut place there. Mama always did what she had to do to take care of the family. I was her everything. I was very much a mama's boy. My mother was love personified.
Cindy's warm heart also extended to those outside the family.
Mama always had an open door policy for all of my friends. They always knew that my mother was there to be a second mother to them, somebody that they could talk to, that she never passed judgment on anybody. She was also very good with giving out the hugs. Mama was always there to give you a hand back up if life knocked you down.
Cindy loved her community. They loved her. She was really representative of a small town in Iowa, the goodness in people.
Cindy's death leaves many in the community wondering who could have killed her. Investigators have an idea on where to start.
Back in that time, about 85% of all homicides in the state of Iowa were committed by someone close to the victim. Husband is always a major suspect at the time we see a homicide like this, especially one with so much rage involved.
Robert was interviewed and gave the following timeline. He had gone to work that morning at Select Motors, where he was a part-time worker because preaching to a small rural congregation is not lucrative employment. Robert returned home at noon, as was his habit. His wife served him spaghetti for lunch, and at 1 o'clock he returned to work. Cindy worked at a local bakery. Her shift was to start at 2 o'clock that day. When she didn't show up for work, her employer became concerned and called Robert. He indicated that he thought perhaps she had simply taken a nap and overslept. Approximately an hour or so later, when she still had not shown up for work, he got the second phone call from his wife's employer. He went home at about 3:30 in the afternoon to discover Cindy dead on the kitchen floor.
What Robert says he did next raises a red flag to detectives.
After finding his wife and then calling to get some help, he took the dog out instead of, being there for his wife or trying to do something for his wife. He said he wanted it to be tied up so that the ambulance people wouldn't have to deal with his pets. That was very unusual and very strange.
Then, Robert offers up a theory investigators find completely ludicrous.
Bob was saying that his wife could have just tripped and fell onto this fork. That was totally not plausible. It didn't make any sense whatsoever. It's just, I can't imagine anyone ending up in a situation, and certainly not with the amount of blood that was found there at the scene too.
He thought that it was an accident. And that really raised eyebrows. How could you possibly think that someone had just fallen? You just think, well, this is someone who snapped.
Bob Borton was our prime suspect immediately after the death of Cynthia Borton because, first of all, he was the last person to see her alive, and then he also was the one that found her.
Coming up, suspicion swells around Cindy's husband.
His work clothing was laundered before investigators had an opportunity to examine it for blood spatter.
What does Robert Borton have to hide?
The only thing I want him to say is, I did it.
While police dig for evidence against their top suspect, a threatening clue sends shockwaves through the town.
There were a great many different and wild rumors, leaving notes at the scene. Cynthia Borton ain't nothing compared to what's coming. And hints such as the NS Night Stalker.
This story just got even more crazy and more sensational and more scary.
Police in Shenandoah, Iowa are investigating the gruesome murder of 39-year-old Cynthia Borton. Her husband Robert's erratic behavior is putting him in detective spotlight.
Robert commented that his wife had simply fallen on an unserving fork and died an accidental death. These comments were certainly unusual and suspicious.
Police bring Robert to the station for a formal interview.
Bob did have a very strange personality and strange mannerisms about him when he was interviewed. He didn't really show any signs of grieving. You would have expected that a man having just lost his wife would be very emotional at the time he was being interviewed, but we didn't see that with Bob Borton. He was very matter-of-fact. He was just so casual in talking even about finding his wife. He acted like that was just an everyday thing. You know, it's just like talking about, well, what's the weather going to be like today?
Detectives question Robert about his relationship with Cindy.
He told us about, having arguments once in a while. He went in kind of a defensive mode about the questioning. When they're reacting like that, it does put up a red flag like that.
Investigators try to provoke a telling reaction out of Robert.
He didn't get upset when I accused him of being the one responsible for his wife's death. He didn't show sadness. He didn't cry.
His stoic but unemotional denials only increased their suspicions.
At that point in time, Bob Borton couldn't be held at all. We had no evidence to show that he was responsible. We had no information other than his matter-of-fact attitude.
Robert provides fingerprint samples, but with nothing concrete linking him to the murder, investigators must let him go.
This, frankly, was frustrating to some of the investigators involved in the case.
Cindy's body has been sent to the medical examiner's office for an autopsy. While police wait to learn a specific time of death, they look to verify Robert's whereabouts.
His boss alibied him for the time that he said that he was at work that day.
Knowing it's still possible Robert killed Cindy when he went home on his lunch break at noon, what his boss tells detectives next rings alarm bells.
He changed his clothes when he went back to work.
Before the body was found, he dropped off his work clothing. It was laundered before investigators had an opportunity to examine it for blood spatter.
Had this all been part of Robert's well-executed plan?
There isn't always transfer of blood from a victim to a perpetrator, even in an extremely bloody killing such as this one. But of course, the likelihood that there would be made it important to examine the clothing, and that was impossible because those clothes, as it happened, were very quickly laundered.
That certainly was a little detail that made us think that it was him.
Investigators conducted a great deal of background interviews with neighbors, friends, co-workers.
We did look into the relationship between Robert and Cynthia Borton to see if it was a good marriage. And we did determine that they did have some problems. Everything wasn't roses and everything wasn't as you might think.
There was quarreling in the house. We thought maybe he had a lot of rage that he wanted to get rid of, and he was taking it out on Cindy. But we had never been called there for family disturbance or anything.
Needing to verify information about Cindy and Robert's relationship, detectives seek out their son, John, but the teen has vanished.
On the day she passed, all I did was shut down. My best friend, Jim, and his mother and father came driving by in their car and attempted to speak with me. I was not in the mood to talk. And then I just kept on walking.
When John arrives back home that night, detectives are there waiting.
They wanted everything that I could tell them while it was still all fresh in my mind. My father and I were still of the impression that it could have been accidental.
When asked about his parents' relationship, John admits there were problems.
There was some disagreements and a little bit of an argument, and then they realized that could I actually find anybody better for me? The answer they came up with was no, so it's like we were happy one time. We need to figure this out, get it worked out. That whole part of the wedding vows of till death do us part, They both took that very seriously.
John is too upset to say much more. Police end their conversation, but plan to talk with him again when he's less distraught. Officers are then dispatched to canvass the area around the Borton home.
They talk to the neighbors and try to find out if there's anybody who witnessed anything suspicious.
A neighbor had seen a teenager running away from the home that day, actually in the afternoon.
The neighbor's description of the teen sounds strikingly familiar.
John Borton, Cynthia's son, fit the description of the person that had run away from the house.
Had John come home early from school to murder his own mother?
It was a fascinating story. It was a mystery. He seemed like your typical teenager.
Bob Borton and also John Borton were the main and only suspects.
That in itself was the shocking part.
Detectives investigating the vicious slaying of Cynthia Borton have two prime suspects. Her husband Robert, who found her dead, and now their 18-year-old son, who matches the description of a teen seen fleeing the area around the time of the murder.
John Borton, even though he was scheduled to have been at school that day, might have come home early. So John Borton early on was a person that we wanted to talk with and get more details about where he was on that day.
The day after the murder, John is brought to the police department for another interview.
They started with the questions about the home life and everything else. I told them my mother was literally my whole world.
When detectives asked John about the last time he saw his mother, he makes a startling admission.
John indicated in his interview that he had had an argument with his mother that morning. That, of course, was interesting and relevant information.
Mother and I did disagree because I was not in the mood to go to school that day. My last words to my mother that day were a bit harsh. I have zero pride or pleasure that I can take from that particular morning.
John maintains he was at school the entire day, but he didn't have any classes between noon and 3 p.m., the approximate window of time when detectives suspect Cindy was murdered.
The whole tone of the investigation changed. They were considering me personally to be a suspect. Who on earth could think that I would do this to my mother?
In a household with three people, the two surviving occupants would always be interviewed and looked at to see if they had an alibi.
We tried to determine with anybody at the school to make sure that they saw him there and to make sure that he was in fact in school, not just that he was supposed to be in school, but that people actually did see him there during that day.
Investigators took aside two of John's friends, Jim and Jackson, to find out if there was anything that might cause them to be concerned about John as a suspect.
The teens can't confirm John was at school the entire day, but they're adamant he's not the killer.
One of the first people to console him about his mother's death was Jim Bettis.
Friends of John Borton said Cynthia Borton's murder had been true devastation for John.
I heard some of my teachers kind of speaking in kind of a low hushed tone thing that the detectives had come by and questioned them as to whether or not I was actually at school. Could anybody verify that I was there all day like I was supposed to be? Eventually, they were able to reconstruct my alibi for the entire afternoon.
Detectives talked with his teachers who verified that he had spent that full day at school.
Cynthia's son John is ruled out as a suspect. 3 days later, the autopsy report comes in, and police look for any insight into what exactly happened that gruesome day.
Cindy suffered a horrifying death. The medical examiner found that Cindy had been stabbed 29 times with at least 4 different instruments, 2 knives and 2 serving forks. In addition to stab wounds that directly led to her death by puncturing vital organs, she had defensive wounds on her hands and forearms. She struggled with her assailant. She had to know that she was dying at the hands of her killer.
The autopsy report also provides a detail crucial to the investigation.
Based upon his finding of a stomach full of completely undigested spaghetti, the medical examiner estimated the time of death as 1 o'clock in the afternoon. Cindy and Robert had shared a meal of spaghetti between 12 and 1 o'clock. Robert placed himself in that home alone in his wife's company at the estimated time of death.
It really made Bob Borton our prime suspect. He was the husband that last saw her alive. He was the husband that was the first to find her dead on the kitchen floor. He and his wife had had difficulties throughout their marriage, had had problems.
Investigators decided that it was important to keep working on Robert. He was really their only feasible suspect.
Based on the findings of the autopsy report and mounting circumstantial evidence, Robert is called back in for another interview.
One of our agents was very aggressive in interrogating Bob Borton about his wife's murder and accusing him of being the murderer. And Bob again sat very calm and still and was not irate about being accused of having taken his wife's life. The investigators decided to give me a call and ask me to conduct a polygraph examination of Bob Borton and do that right away before he had a chance to think twice about it. The relevant questions that I asked Bob Borton is, were you responsible for your wife's death? Did you cause your wife's death? Did you stab your wife? He was just very humdrum, very relaxed, and very, well, I guess, you'll have to do what you have to do because I didn't do it.
The polygraph results tell a different story.
He failed the polygraph. The results were that he was lying and that he was culpable in this crime. So investigators were, in fact, increasingly convinced that Robert had killed his wife.
One week after the gruesome murder of Cindy Borton, her husband Robert, the prime suspect in her murder, has just failed a polygraph.
When I did see those results, the thing that next happens is for me to go in and interrogate him and try to determine why he was being deceptive. I needed to try to get a confession from him. When I confronted him with the results of the polygraph examination, he didn't shake his head no that he didn't do it. He didn't try to respond to me in any way, shape, or form. He just basically sat in a chair and didn't move. The only thing I want him to say is, I did it. And so we were very aggressive in interrogating Bob Borton about his wife's murder.
Robert Borton never wavered in his denial that he was responsible for this.
Robert's behavior under questioning becomes even more unusual.
He did, in fact, fall asleep in the chair. The only time that anybody has ever fallen asleep in the middle of one of my interrogations. Bob Borton's reactions were not what we would have considered to be normal.
Despite failing the polygraph, the evidence against Robert is purely circumstantial, so detectives have no choice but to let him go.
At that point in time, we're thinking we must have missed something. There must be something more involved that we're not aware of.
The lack of an arrest unsettles the town further.
The people of the community really are concerned when there is an immediate suspect, why that person's not apprehended and taken to jail. But we need more information. We need more evidence.
The members of the community were increasingly convinced that Robert had killed his wife. They expressed those concerns. They brought a great deal of pressure on the chief of police.
The public was just as anxious to get it solved as the police was. We wanted to get this case cleared up so gossip and things would die down after, of course, this happened. He wasn't preaching for a while, and then people just quit attending.
There was a real change my father noticed. People who were open and friendly with him, all of a sudden, they quite often would go as far as to cross the street so that they would not have to walk near him, would not have to speak with him. I did my best to at least attempt to continue my life as well as I could.
Laying Cindy to rest is tough on the young teen.
The only time I can remember my mother having a brand new dress was the one bought for her to bury her in. It's the only brand new dress I ever recall her having.
2 months after Cindy's murder, Robert and John leave Shenandoah.
It was unbearable for my father to continue to live there. People who he thought had been friends before had shut him out.
He moved to a town 3 hours away, and we watched his movements, where he went, who he was meeting with.
The police were really struggling because they had nothing. They had no one else.
2.5 months later, when the state crime lab sends investigators the results of the fingerprint analysis, they hope it'll be the crucial evidence for which they've been waiting.
Robert's fingerprints were not found on any of the murder weapons or the phone. This, frankly, was frustrating to some of the investigators involved in the case. It was solid evidence that someone other than Robert Borton was very possibly the guilty party in this murder.
The news is a huge blow to the investigation.
It's concerning whenever cases are not immediately solvable, and as time passes, the prospects for solving them become smaller and smaller.
We just waited for authorities to make an arrest. And when they didn't make an arrest in the months that were going by, that's when we started to realize this is somebody that they don't know who it is.
3 months after the murder, as detectives redouble their efforts to unearth new suspects, another crime in Shenandoah comes to their attention.
In the weeks preceding and following the murder of Cindy Borton, there were arsons in the town of Shenandoah. Even though arson is a different crime than murder, it's a violent crime. And when one has a series of violent crimes, in this case, the arsons and the murder, all occurring within a matter of weeks, it would be only normal to at least examine the possibility of a connection between the two.
On November 30th, another arson occurs, and a clue found at the scene leaves investigators stunned.
The arsonist left a note referring to the 2 prior arsons and Cynthia Borton, and in fact threatened more violence in that community, saying that the arsons and Cindy Borton ain't nothing compared to what's coming.
Oh my gosh, this story just got even more crazy and more sensational and more scary.
Detectives hunting the killer of Cindy Borton have just received a mysterious clue linking her murder to a series of arson fires across town.
There was a note that was, in fact, very intriguing, and the note referred to all 3 arsons and Cindy Borton, obviously raising the possibility that the perpetrator of the arsons was also the perpetrator of the Cindy Borton murder. The note in question was signed The Night Stalker, NS, which copied the name of a highly publicized murderer in California.
At the time, the Night Stalker had already been arrested, so this was clearly a copycat killer.
It was rather apparent that the perpetrator was someone who used that name out of convenience and imitation.
He was calling himself the Night Stalker. Wow, he's just crazy.
There were a great many different and wild rumors, leaving notes at the scene and hints such as the NS Night Stalker were quite possibly a cry for attention. This would have to be investigated. The note was examined for fingerprints, and indeed some latent fingerprint ridge detail was found on the note.
The prints are sent to the crime lab for analysis.
It was important not only to continue investigating the murder, but also to investigate the arsons for purpose of developing a suspect on the murder. There had been 3 arsons in the community. One had been at the Broad Street School. The letters NS were found slashed on a bridge near the Broad Street School fire.
There was another fire set in a school teacher's pickup, and there was a note, "The Night Stalker strikes again."
This case was a genuine whodunit. Even though we had the Night Stalker note, investigators didn't know who had authored it or who had committed the arsons.
I never really would have expected this case to go where it went. It wasn't something that we expected from the beginning at all.
Several days later, detectives get the fingerprint results from the note, and they don't match back to anyone in their database.
There was, in fact, a killer at loose in their community.
As every week went by, and then the months, we kept wondering, why is it so hard to capture a murderer in this small town who committed a murder in such a shocking, unbelievable manner?
On January 31st, 1989, police finally get a break in the case.
5 months after this murder, a young man named Jackson, a high school student, came into the police department and informed authorities that the previous day he'd had a visit from a friend, another teenager, and that in the course of their afternoon visiting with each other, this friend had told him that he had some very shocking information and something that was bothering him. More specifically, that he had murdered Cynthia Borton. This information was a shock that shed an entirely new light on the investigation.
When Jackson came into the Shenandoah Police Department, yes, that definitely was a big break. His friend had told him things that happened at the crime scene that only the killer would know.
Jackson's friend described the murder that he had committed and even went so far as to draw a small diagram indicating exactly where the body had been left in the house. Jackson shared this drawing as well with the authorities, which was important and surprising because it appeared quite accurate.
He told Jackson, "I'm going to show you where the knife is." And he did that. And that's when Jackson realized, oh, he's really done this. And later that day, even though he was sworn to secrecy, he thought about his own mom and how the killer had been a guest in their house, and he thought, wow, that could have been my mom. So it wasn't hard for him to go to the police after that.
At this point, investigators were aware that Jackson had indeed very likely spoken to Cindy Borton's murderer.
Jackson said that James Bettis was the one responsible for killing Cynthia Borton.
Jim Bettis was a close friend of John Borton. They were classmates until Jimmy dropped out of high school. He was close enough to John and interacted with the Bortons so much that Cindy was very involved in Jim's life. He even thought of Cindy as a second mother to him. She tried to help him, tried to persuade him to return to school and get an education. She was a very good friend and mother figure to the young man. Jim was certainly not a suspect up to this point, but his statement to Jackson rang true.
It was amazement at that point in time because we talked to James Bettis previously. James Bettis became the prime suspect because of his admissions to his friend. But we need more corroboration. Jim was taken to the Shenandoah Police Department and he was interviewed. Jim did confess to the arsons, as a matter of fact, but denied ever having said anything to Jackson about Cynthia Borton's murder or having any involvement in Cynthia Borton's murder.
Jim agrees to have his fingerprints collected. He's also willing to undergo a polygraph.
During the polygraph examination, the questions I would ask were, was he involved in the death of Cynthia Borton? Specifically, whether he was the one that committed the crime.
Jimmy Bettis insisted throughout that he did not kill Cindy Borton.
When I quantified the polygraph examinations, and I actually gave a numerical figure to each of his reactions, if they're over a -6, that strongly indicates to us that he's deceptive. James Bettis came up a -23. So there is absolutely no question he was the one involved in Cynthia Borton's murder.
It was a big shock, and it really left us, and I think everyone, scratching their head. Wow, we didn't see that coming.
5 months after the horrific slaying of Cindy Borton, detectives get their biggest break when her son's friend fails a polygraph.
Jim Bettis' polygraph, according to Agent McCleary, showed deception on his denial that he had murdered Cindy Borton.
It was very unusual that all of a sudden this person would become a suspect who was a teenager, and also he was good friends with Cynthia's son. And he had been in Cynthia's house on many occasions.
Investigators confront Jim with the results.
The very next thing I said was, we all know exactly what happened on September 6th. You are the one responsible for having killed Cynthia Borton. There's no question in anybody's mind now. And he came out and said, I did it. Okay, I did it.
Jim Bettis had not been on our radar at all. We never dreamed that he might be capable of something like this.
James Bettis told me that on September 6th of 1988, he was walking around town, he was thinking about his father. He was thinking about how he hated his father.
His dad was always telling him that he was no good, he wasn't going to amount to anything. It was terrible. He hated his dad.
He needed to be able to get that rage out. How he was going to do that was by seeing if he could actually kill.
His statement was that he wanted to kill his father, but that he knew he couldn't get that job done, and so he killed someone who was far more vulnerable, and that Cynthia Borton was a victim of convenience.
Police believe Jim showed up at the Borton household, just narrowly missing Robert, who had gone back to work after lunch.
Cynthia Borton answered the door and allowed him to come in because he had been there many times previously.
During his confession, Jimmy Bettis indicated that he had asked Cindy for a glass of water, which led her to walk into the kitchen. He followed her there, approaching her from behind, and grabbing a knife, immediately slashed her throat from behind. He stated he had used a pocket knife of his own in addition to Cynthia Borton's kitchen utensils. And that after the crime, he took his pocket knife, stained with Cindy Borton's blood, and threw it under a bridge. This was important information. It would corroborate his confession if in fact that knife could be found, and if in fact it had Cindy Borton's blood on it. Investigators scoured the area, found the knife where Jimmy Bettis described that they would find it, and when it was tested at the laboratory, indeed it had not only Cindy Borton's blood, but also Jimmy Bettis's fingerprint.
On February 2nd, 1989, detectives charge 18-year-old Jim Bettis with first-degree murder and 3 counts of arson.
The investigator told me that Jim had been arrested and he had confessed repeatedly. My first response was, no, he did not do this. He was my best friend. He was the first person that I trusted that was not an actual blood relative. It occurred to me that in at least some way I am responsible for this because I am the reason that he came into my house, that he was accepted into my house, and my mother is gone. There is nothing I can do to get her back.
At trial, Jim is convicted, and on November 13th, 1989, he's sentenced to life in prison.
Jimmy Bettis was a very troubled and angry and rage-filled young man. Had this crime not been solved when it was, there's every reason to be concerned that there would have been more fires, if not more murders.
My best friend committed this heinous crime of murder against somebody who trusted him, supported him, and cared for him. He frequently told me that we were brothers forever, and I honestly felt the same thing for him. And then for him to turn around and do such a horrific action, there is a bit of relief knowing that he will never be out again for the rest of his life. I want as many people as possible to know and understand what a wonderful, wonderful person my mother was, which is why I share her with as many people as I possibly can. I only miss her on days that end in Y. I am still waiting for my pain to go away. I don't know that it ever will.
A vibrant young woman with a bright future.
She just was like a magnet. She was very, very pretty, but also very smart.
Is the victim of a truly disturbing murder.
He'd been struck on the head many times.
It's kind of the horror story.
The body itself appeared to have been washed. Jewelry had been put on her after the fact.
She has been staged for this suspect's desires. Who could have done this? Could it be somebody who likes her, somebody who has a fantasy over her?
Detectives hunt for a deranged killer.
We noticed bloodied palm print.
Police had collected about 100 different print impressions.
We could be looking for a serial killer.
Just when it looks like justice may never be served.
It was extremely frustrating.
A stunning discovery points to a murderer in their midst.
When we found out who it was like, are you kidding? Nobody could believe it.
Less than an hour outside Los Angeles, Irvine, California is a peaceful community with a coastal vibe.
Irvine is very, very pretty. It is pretty much the hub of Orange County. The ocean's only 10 minutes away, and this is where everybody wanted to be.
Irvine has always been considered to be a very safe city and has not been known for violence.
On May 14th, 1979, Irvine's sense of safety is shattered when a man calls 911 to say he can't get a hold of his 22-year-old girlfriend, Savannah Anderson.
Earlier that day, her boyfriend went over to her residence to meet her at about 6 o'clock. He couldn't get any response at the door.
He went back home for a while, couldn't get a hold of her still.
He called the police department about 7:25 p.m. It was a welfare check. Her boyfriend indicated that she had not been feeling well, and so there was a concern that it could be a health issue. When the officer arrived, he met her boyfriend, Bill Mills, and another man, Ken Bergenson, who identified himself as her boss.
They explained they'd both come to the apartment to try to find out if she was okay because nobody'd been able to get a hold of her that day.
I was very fortunate to work with Savannah. Savannah was always prompt, and she didn't come that day. All day long, it was like trying to get a hold of her, no answers. By the end of the day, we were very concerned something might have happened because that wasn't like her.
The officer found the apartment was in fact locked up tight. There was no key available from the apartment office. The officer found out that a bedroom window nearby was unlocked from the inside. He was able to open that bedroom window.
When the officer made entry, he was able to see a woman with a lot of blood around her, lying in bed, towels wrapped around her face and head. She was cold to the touch.
Both Savannah's boyfriend and boss are taken to the station for questioning, while homicide investigators are called to the scene.
When I walked in, it appeared to me that there was a struggle, a fight, and it was very clear that she was attacked on the bed, and she laid on the bed for some time due to the amount of blood that had pooled in that area. A lot of blood splattering against the back of the wall and the headboard.
She also had towels over her face. After the towels were taken off, her face was found out to be beaten very severely, excessively.
The towels were significant. It tells you that the killer may have known her and didn't want to look at what they've done.
It appeared that the body of the victim had been beaten with something hard.
She had multiple defensive marks on her arms, her hands, nail marks around the neck area, which would indicate that she also had a ligature that had been placed around her neck.
The legs were slightly raised as if some sexual activity may have occurred there.
Perhaps she was the victim of a sexual assault.
The degree of violence to Savannah's body was unusual. Did somebody do it because they were angry at her? If they were angry at her, is that because they knew her, they loved her, they hated her?
Based on the state of the body, police believe Savannah was likely killed in the early hours of the morning. Looking closer, several details strike investigators as highly unusual.
Savannah had some jewelry on her. There was a necklace around her neck, and the clasp was at the front. There was also a watch on her arm that looked like it had just been put on there loosely.
We were surprised to see that those items were still intact on her based upon the brutality of her attacker. So it appeared that he may have just put those items back on her.
The body itself appeared to have been washed, as there's very little blood on the skin surface of the victim.
We noticed drag marks from the bed onto the carpet leading into the bathroom. Inside the bathroom, there was diluted blood with water around the sink area and also the bathtub.
She looked like she had been cleaned up and set in a particular position on the bed. It was staged for this suspect's desires. And I think that was important to get an idea of what this type of person was willing to do to Savannah's body, put things on her, put clothes on her, whatever.
It was very unusual for any type of murder, in my opinion. It looks like somebody wanted to make it look like she was fine and nothing was wrong.
Police find some important clues the killer left behind.
We noticed bloodied palm print leading from the bedroom into the bathroom. Palm prints are identifiable just like fingerprints. There were smudged, bloodied fingerprints on the toilet seat.
They were basically the only way that we'd be able to find out who the killer might have been. There was no DNA at the time.
Detectives find no murder weapon or any sign of forced entry.
We made the determination that the killer may have been known by Savannah and let him in through the front door. Another theory was through an unlocked open window.
After finishing up at the scene, detectives break the news of Savannah's death to her loved ones.
The parents lived in Utah. When I spoke to Savannah's mother on the phone, she was devastated by this. It was her only child. It's probably hard for most people to realize, first of all, what it's like to lose a child, let alone the only child you have. Savannah's mother said Savannah had made a collect call to her about 10 o'clock the previous day on Mother's Day evening. They had talked on the phone for about 2 hours. Savannah was very happy, good mood. That must have made it even more so difficult.
When I found out what had happened to Savannah, we were all totally shocked. My heart just hurt so much. How very sad this beautiful young lady, her life was gone, is very senseless, very, very hard to understand.
Born in 1956, Savannah Anderson grew up in Salt Lake City, Utah, and had big dreams.
She was 22 when she moved to Irvine. She came here looking for a better opportunity. She was very independent, and she wanted to do it on her own. I met Savannah when she was working here for Commercial Credit. Savannah was a secretary for the operations manager. She just was like a magnet. She was very, very pretty. I remember when people did come in the office, especially the men, she did attract attention.
Savannah was flattered, but she did have a boyfriend, Bill Mills, whom she met 3 months after moving to California.
She was more of a private person into herself, as far as not one to just open up and tell everybody what she was doing. She was definitely on the shy side. When I found out what had happened to Savannah, I felt angry and just crushed and so hurt. My first thought was just how tragic this was. I just can't imagine.
It's kind of the horror story. Who could have done this? Could it be somebody close to her, somebody who knows her, somebody who likes her, somebody who has a fantasy over her? When you have a brutal killing like Savannah's case, detectives immediately looked for the people that are close to her, her boyfriend.
The fact that Bill, the boyfriend, was the one that called the police, is he innocently calling the police here because he doesn't know that something had happened to her? Or is he the one who may have done it, so he contacted the police to say, gee, something might be wrong, with the hopes that the police will go ahead and discover the crime and then say, well, it can't be the boyfriend because he called us here. Could it be almost a way out to try to point the finger away from you? It's just something you have to look into.
Coming up, police question the grieving boyfriend to see if he has something to hide.
His attorney advised him not to take a polygraph.
And detectives uncover more suspects.
Why is he here now at this time? That was suspicious.
Somebody was lying.
Another crime turns the investigation on its head.
This individual was responsible for 5 murders. Perhaps she was the victim of this killer.
And the perpetrator's identity leaves everyone in shock.
It was absolutely devastating when we found out who it was.
Police investigating the gruesome murder of 22-year-old Savannah Anderson have their first suspect, her boyfriend, Bill Mills.
When you have a crime of passion where somebody is murdered, there are definitely times when a boyfriend who just got angry and upset did the crime.
The first thing we did was began meeting with Bill Mills so we could understand better about Savannah, his relationship.
Bill tells police he and Savannah started dating 6 months ago, and he was in love.
They had met each other in another apartment community. They had gotten along well.
He was about 9 years older than Savannah. In talking with him, had learned that he had just asked her to marry him.
Police are curious if something came up to disrupt the couple's plans for the future.
It was a large, violent crime scene. Did he do it because he was angry at her?
Bill tells investigators he last saw Savannah a day earlier on May 13th.
They had brunch together, and then he spent the day over at her apartment. During the interview with Bill Mills, we found out that Savannah and he did have sex that day. So that would be important later on in case there was semen found inside of her.
Bill told me on the 13th he left her apartment at about 10 p.m.
Once he did leave, what happened to him? Can anybody account for his activity after he apparently left her apartment?
He said he went home, he went to bed, and then to work the following day.
Bill says he and Savannah had plans on the 14th after they both got off work.
He went to her apartment about 6, knocked, couldn't raise her. He went back home for a while, then Bill Mills went ahead and contacted the police department.
Bill denies having anything to do with Savannah's death.
It appeared that Bill Mills was really in love with her, thought it was a very serious relationship. He was very happy with her.
Bill was cooperative. He tried to assist us as much as he could.
But there is one request Bill won't comply with.
There is a red flag. He was asked if he would be willing to take a polygraph. He contacted an attorney, and his attorney advised him not to take one.
We did ask if we could see his body, his hands, his arms, see if there's any indications of a struggle with anybody. But his body was clean. We asked him if we could go ahead and take his finger and palm prints. He agreed to let us do that.
It will be weeks before the results come in. In the meantime, detectives are forced to let Bill go. Next, they move on to another man in Savannah's life.
Part of the investigation and process was to meet with her boss, Ken Bergeson, who had been at the crime scene. In speaking with him, he said he had known her in Salt Lake and had offered her a job locally here.
Ken Bergeson also said that he kind of considered himself a father figure to her. He helped her move. They had talked many times, been out for drinks, been out for lunch and different things.
Could Ken have wanted more than a professional relationship with Savannah?
Was anything going on romantically in the present day?
I asked Ken where he was the night of May 13th, and he indicated that he was with his wife that whole evening.
We did contact the wife to verify that, and there's no reason to believe that he was anywhere but at his home that night.
After the interview, we asked Ken to submit his prints so they could be compared against the crime scene.
We just let him go home that night after the interview.
The police questioned each one of us in the office. I worked for Ken Bergeson at the time. He was just such a nice guy and so concerned about her. She was living by herself, and she was just so beautiful. I just thought, somebody saw her. Somebody was either stalking her or something happened. But I was just so angry that somebody could possibly do something like this. It had to have been somebody I thought who was very sick.
There was nothing really that drew anyone's attention to any issues that Savannah had at work, and nothing came of it.
Police canvassed the apartment complex the next day, searching for witnesses.
We didn't find anyone that said that they'd heard any struggle or screams to corroborate when that attack may have occurred. There were 2 security guards that were assigned to the complex. It was a multi-unit under construction.
So after I got the names of the security personnel who worked that night, which was about a week after we originally responded out there, I talked to the security guard first who worked the midnight to 6:30 shift. His name is Chuck Doyle.
According to Doyle, security was hired to ensure the residents were safe and to overlook any construction sites and that sort of thing for theft.
Chuck tells investigators on a usual shift he would drive through the complex and also patrol by foot.
I asked him how he found out about the murder of the woman, and he said he found out through the company. I asked him if he knew the lady who lived there, showed him 2 pictures, and he picked out the picture of Savannah Anderson.
When asked about his dealings with Savannah, Chuck's answer gives investigators cause for concern.
He indicated about a month prior that he'd helped Savannah gain entry into her apartment and slid a window open for her.
It was notable that Mr. Doyle had said he was aware that at least at that time one of the windows was unlocked.
Doyle said, "You'll find my fingerprints on Savannah's window, and this is the reason why." Immediately, we printed him. It really made me zero in on him as a potential suspect.
A week after Savannah Anderson was found bludgeoned to death in her bed, security guard Chuck Doyle has drawn suspicion after admitting that his fingerprints are likely on her unlocked window.
She had locked herself out of her apartment before, contacted him while he was on the site to see if he could help her get into the apartment. The security did not have any pass keys. He found that a window was unlocked. He was able to slide the window open. He also said that he didn't go inside. It could be for a couple of reasons. Could be perfectly innocent that he didn't go inside. Could also be to say, well, I didn't go inside if he may have somehow be involved in the death.
Had Chuck slipped in through the same unlocked window to kill Savannah? Police press him for his movements that night.
Chuck Doyle said that he reported for duty on the 14th at midnight, or was supposed to, indicated that he was about 10 minutes, 15 minutes late.
He was supposed to replace a security guard named Bob Sellers.
He drove by Savannah's and saw her talking on the phone. He thought maybe that was around 12:15 or so, 12:20, but was not certain.
He went and parked next to Bob Sellers' car. About 12:30, he estimated, Sellers approached. He got daily reports from Sellers, and then Sellers went ahead and got in his car and drove off.
When detectives ask what happened next, Chuck's answer raises even more suspicion.
He said he drove around a while, went back to the carport, and went to sleep, which would seem very odd.
He thought he probably nodded off for a while.
Doyle says that he was awoken by a car door slam. It was Sellers who had returned and invited him to breakfast. Doyle says it was maybe 1 or 2 in the morning. They went to breakfast at Spire's restaurant, a 24-hour cafe.
The cafe is just 10 minutes from the complex.
Doyle said that he was dropped off by Sellers at about 2:30 in the morning.
Chuck says the rest of his shift was uneventful, and he clocked out at 6:30 a.m.
There's just something really unusual about the sequence of events that's being described by Doyle.
Investigators are left with more questions than answers. Did Savannah die on Chuck's watch? Or was he the one who killed her? Hoping for clarity and to corroborate Chuck's story, they turn to the other security guard, Robert Sellers.
Robert Sellers enlisted into the Marine Corps at age 17. He's 22 now.
He was assigned that day to work from about 4 in the afternoon, and he was supposed to get off at about midnight that night. I asked him if he knew who Savannah Anderson was. He said he had talked to both her and her boyfriend that evening.
Sellers told me that he thought he saw Savannah around 10 p.m. on the phone.
Robert confirms that Chuck was late for work, so he didn't leave the apartment complex until around 12:30 a.m.
After leaving Doyle, he then went home, showered.
As a U.S. Marine, he was supposed to go to a Marine base. At 6 o'clock in the morning,
he decided it wasn't worth trying to go to sleep, so he thought, well, I'll just go out to breakfast with Doyle. So that's when he returned.
Sellers told me that he came back to the complex about 3:30, which is an hour and a half or 2 hours after what Doyle recalled this happening. So there was this inconsistency between the both of them about what time they must have gone to the restaurant. Sellers said there was a waitress named Gail who waited on him. I took note of that. At the end of the Sellers interview, we asked if he would go ahead and give us finger palm prints, which he agreed to.
Investigators hope the autopsy report can help them pinpoint Savannah's time of death.
According to the coroner's report, Savannah Anderson died at approximately 2 a.m. on May 14th. The cause of death was strangulation.
She'd been struck on the head many times, found multiple contusions on her face. There was broken fingernails, a broken jaw, cracked teeth.
We did have biological fluids, semen, that was found, but DNA was not in existence at the time, so we didn't have that tool.
My first thought was just how horrible to die like that. I cried and I was just very upset, just thinking that something like that had happened to a person that was just so lovely. It's just terrible.
If Savannah was killed at 2 a.m., which security guard is telling the truth? Was Chuck really off site like he claimed? Or was Robert right, meaning Chuck was at the apartment complex when the murder took place?
There was a wide gap and discrepancy between their two stories and timing. So the two were brought in together to try and determine if someone was mistaken about times.
They both basically stuck to their stories. I wasn't sure which either timeline might have been correct, whether it might have been Doyle's or Sellers, because they were just too far apart. So we thought at that time somebody was lying.
Detectives are investigating the disturbing murder of Savannah Anderson. The two security guards from her apartment complex are unable to agree where they were at 2 a.m. when Savannah was killed.
The timing is very sketchy between what Doyle says and what we learned from Sellers.
This is raising a lot of flags to me, because why don't they know where they were and what time they were?
Going over time discrepancies, Doyle said, well, I slept, I could be mistaken, I'm not sure. So Sellers seemed to be more credible time-wise.
According to Robert Sellers, Chuck was on duty at 2 a.m. and the pair only went to Spire's restaurant around 3:30 a.m.
I asked one of the patrol guys to go ahead and try to contact any waitress there that might have been named Gail to see if she recalled the security guys coming in there at all. They weren't able to find a Gail that worked at the Spire's restaurant, so we could not identify that particular part of the story. It looked like the best chance of us determining who the suspect was going to be through the fingerprint and palm print evidence left behind. At this time, we already had fingerprints and palm prints from the boyfriend, Bill Mills, the boss, Ken Bergerson, and from the two security guards, Chuck Doyle and Bob Sellers. And I felt that if we can find out if any of those were the palm prints, that's going to be the resolution of our case. We'd be able to determine who had done it. So we sent them away with high hopes that we're going to be able to resolve the case once we get the results back.
While waiting for the results, investigators dig deeper into Savannah's life, hoping something will point to her killer.
Savannah seemed to be a very likable person who had, from all reports, a good mind, good IQ, personable, funny, one that you would be very happy to have as a daughter.
She was very sweet, very sophisticated, quiet. She had very strong values and morals. You know, she was just not one of those that was going to be out looking for trouble. Just how she went and how young she went is so tragic. Our world is, it's cruel.
We interviewed neighbors. Savannah had been at the apartment complex about 6 weeks. Her contacts, friends were very limited. What I learned through investigation was Savannah had moved deliberately for the safety of having security on the premises.
She really wanted a place that felt safe, and the fact that they had security, she loved that aspect of it. She felt really good about where she was going.
2 months after Savannah's death, police received the results of the finger and palm print analysis from the scene.
I was really hoping we heard back from the crime lab that it's going to be one of the guys we'd already talked to.
In terms of identification and finding and identifying that individual, it was everything.
None of the prints that came back were any of the fingerprints submitted from the bloody finger and palm prints. Really disappointing. Couldn't figure out why. It seemed like there should have been somebody in there that was responsible for it, yet the crime lab is telling us that these weren't the responsible parties at all. We thought we had some viable suspects, but we're told, nope, it's not them. Well, now what? Wow.
The results mean Savannah's boyfriend, her boss, and the two security guards are all cleared.
I was very discouraged, but thought, okay, we just haven't come across the perpetrator. He's out there. We'll find him. We'll identify him. I feel comfortable with that based on the palm print.
Detectives immediately looked for people in the area that maybe had criminal histories. They looked at people that had been arrested after that for similar type of break-in crimes. And if they had any suspicions whatsoever, they would get their palm print and their fingerprints, and they'd compare them to the crime scene prints and then rule them out if they didn't match.
3 months after the crime, police had collected about 100 different print impressions.
The palm prints didn't match. It was extremely frustrating to work through this.
With the case threatening to turn cold, detectives refused to quit and take the case in a chilling new direction.
After going through potential suspects that were eliminated through the palm print, we began to examine that Savannah Anderson may be the victim of a serial killer known as the Bedroom Basher. This individual was responsible for 5 murders in the Orange County area at the time.
With a population under 2 million people, the number of attacks in a matter of months is troubling, and the similarities striking.
He would target young lone females between 17 and 35, ground floor apartments, open windows, open doors. Once inside, he would bludgeon, strangle, and sexually assault the females. So Savannah certainly fit that MO. And so we had to take a real strong look at perhaps she was the victim of this individual who had not been identified. We could be looking for a serial killer.
Detectives investigating the brutal murder of Savannah Anderson now believe she may have fallen victim to a serial killer.
Bedroom Basher went after females in homes or apartments in the Orange County area, raped them, in at least one case, killed somebody by bludgeoning them, which is what happened to Savannah.
Based upon the number of bludgeonings in Orange County, which were 5, we felt that there would be another that would take place.
5 months after Savannah's murder, investigators' worst fears are confirmed when the serial killer strikes again.
During this time, there was a woman in Orange County that had been attacked, believed by the Bedroom Basher, who survived and was able to give a description to the police. A composite drawing was made. She described the perpetrator as a male, olive skin, pockmarked face, long hair, mustache, dark eyes, in his late 20s, early 30s. A task force was created in Orange County. Flyers were disseminated to the public and to patrol units. It resulted in multiple contacts of people who believed they knew who this individual was. Unfortunately, none of those resulted in the apprehension of the individual.
A year after the murder, with no arrests and a killer on the loose, women in the area live in a constant state of terror.
The community was definitely impacted by this terrible murder. The news was full of these kind of things, and it did create fear among people. The fact that I was living so close by, it's a little scary.
Any female who resided by themselves took extra precautions to ensure that their windows, doors were in fact locked. Every possibility we looked at, we were unable to make any headway in determining what happened to Savannah Anderson. It was extremely frustrating. There was no one else that we were aware of that could provide any insight and or potentially could be a suspect.
3 years after Savannah's murder, her case remains unsolved.
After you go through tips, leads, you step back, you re-examine, you say, what did I miss? It's got to be there. What did I miss?
I started to believe that they just weren't going to find out. And that's terrible to think that something like that could happen and that this person is out there roaming around still.
2 more years pass until a rookie homicide detective takes a renewed interest in the case.
Savannah's case was the first cold case that I ever worked. I was familiar with it because I was in patrol when it happened, and I thought, well, nobody's looked at it for a while. Maybe I should look at it.
A friend of mine who knows Larry Montgomery very well calls him the evidence whisperer.
I was aware he was looking at the Savannah Anderson case, and at one point he came to me and we compared notes on it.
After combing through all the evidence, detectives revisit whether Savannah was a victim of the still unidentified bedroom basher.
The possibility that she was killed by a serial killer was definitely looked at. I was looking at anything that I could use to direct me to a possible suspect. I'm looking at what was done at the crime scene, what did the suspect do with the body, what was maybe in his mind because of what he did.
In comparing Savannah's murder to those committed by the bedroom basher, something just doesn't add up.
The one thing that stood out that was not similar was the cleaning up of the victim.
When I look at a crime scene like this, it's somebody who has a desire for Savannah. She appeared uninjured other than towels on top of her face. It wasn't the gore that he liked. He had to kill her in order to get her into a position where he could fantasize about having an actual relationship with her. This is a real girl now as opposed to a dead body. The question in this case is, who did it? All the people we've looked at and that looked good were not matching the prints. There was one point where I started looking at the security guards to see what they were doing because they were certainly involved in being there at the time. There were very big differences between what Doyle said happened and what Sellers said happened that night. And I thought that was very odd.
I thought at the time that I interviewed Doyle that one of the problems was he may have gone to sleep for a while. That would certainly account for the timeline being different or his uneasiness in talking to us about that particular time period.
Police quickly locate Chuck and bring him in for another interview. His story about what happened the night of the murder is the same, but a few details stand out.
Doyle said that he got to the site probably 10 minutes late. He had not been able to find the person he was supposed to replace yet, Bob Sellers. About 12:30, Doyle saw Sellers come with a shirt in his hand, and I asked Doyle, did you ever ask him why he was late or why he didn't have his uniform shirt on? He said, no, he never asked him that. He just figures he's on his own time, so he could probably wear whatever he wants.
That's unusual. That right there's a big red flag.
That's not the only thing that raises alarm bells.
Doyle said that Sellers had commented about wanting to have a drink with Savannah. He thought she was very attractive.
Detectives asked Chuck Doyle if Robert Sellers ever confided anything else to him.
Regarding the relationship between Doyle and Sellers, they weren't buddies. They didn't do things together. They weren't really close friends.
Following this lead, investigators asked Chuck if it was common for them to go for breakfast during a shift, like they did the night of the murder.
They never did that before. So why is Sellers there on a night when he's supposed to leave soon to go to work at the Marine base, saying, hey, you want to go get something to eat? It didn't seem to fit. But I had the paperwork that shows that he had been exonerated. It wasn't his print. But I saw all kinds of things that Sellers did that was suspicious. Why is he here now at this time? It all fits if he came back and did something with the body at that time. It all made sense time-wise. And that's when I decided we need to find those prints again and see if we matched them properly.
"5 years after Savannah Anderson was found murdered in her apartment, cold case investigators suspect her killer has been hiding in plain sight the entire time.
I've got a suspicion that this guy, Robert Sellers, might be the guy because there's too many lies or mistakes. He's already been exonerated, and I didn't believe the exoneration. We need to find somebody who's better than our sheriff's department, who's best in the world that we can get.
Robert's prints and the ones found at the crime scene are rushed to FBI headquarters.
The FBI discovered that some parts of the palm print were so thick with blood that it became a negative. It was the opposite of what it should be because of the thick blood. The thick blood looked like the ridges when really they were the valleys of the print.
The FBI reanalyzed the palm print and compared it to prints obtained from Robert.
The next day, the fingerprint lab at the FBI was able to identify about 24 points of identification, a positive identification of security guard Bob Sellers.
We have to arrest him now. Sellers, at the time that he was arrested, was living in a mobile home up in Brea at the police department. He was presented with evidence that his prints are in fact in the blood there. He didn't come forward right away, but very quickly after he had some lies, he did admit that he did everything that we thought he did.
He was obsessed with her. He found her very attractive. He thought perhaps by going into her apartment that he might convince her of some romantic get-together. He gained entry into her apartment through an unlocked window where he could hear her on the telephone talking with her mother. He stayed in the bedroom, hid as best possible while she talked in the kitchen living room area. Once she got off the phone at about a little after 12, she came into the bedroom. When she saw him, she was thinking, I have an intruder, a man in here, and I'm frightened. And he became frightened and realized that he had to silence her. He pulled out his baton and began striking her. He then went to strangulation.
During the struggle with Savannah, he said that his shirt got bloody, so he had to take it off. So when he went to see Doyle, he had his shirt in his hand so that his replacement would not see the blood on it.
And then he goes home, gets cleaned up, sneaks back in, and then goes into Savannah's apartment. Sellers wanted her sexually. He had to kill her to get that. He did talk about he wanted her to be clean, and so that's why he drug her into the shower and washed the blood off of her and took her back into the bedroom and wrapped her head in towels because she was so badly beaten. So then he just had a body that was clean and he could have his fantasy. At 3 o'clock in the morning, he's trying to sneak out, and that's when Doyle sees him, and that's when, at the spur of the moment, he has to all of a sudden pretend like, oh, I'm here to go to breakfast with you, okay? He almost seemed relieved when he finally was able to confess that he actually did kill Savannah.
On March 29, 1984, Robert Sellers is charged with murder, rape, attempted rape, and burglary.
I think after 5 years, he thought he probably did get away with it. In that time, he got married, started a family. The anguish that he caused with Savannah Anderson's death, he didn't deserve having that extra 5 years.
On November 4th, 1986, Robert Sellers is found guilty of first-degree murder and a special circumstance of rape. But his lawyers win his appeal.
His conviction was overturned on a technicality. The fact that the prosecution could not prove that she was alive during the rape changed the verdict for a life without possibility of parole.
Instead of a retrial, prosecutors offer Robert a deal. He accepts to avoid the death penalty and pleads guilty to first-degree murder. He is sentenced to 25 years to life in prison.
Here you have a guard, a man, a Marine, placed there to protect the residents, and it turned out he is the one committing the crime. One would not expect the one who is protecting you to be your killer.
It was absolutely devastating when we found out who it was. The irony of it all was the fact that she moved to this beautiful apartment complex thinking she was going to be safe and secure. And it was the security guard that actually did it. It was like, are you kidding? Nobody could believe it.
Authorities don't find anything to link Robert Sellers to the bedroom basher killings. In 1996, Gerald Parker was identified and convicted of those crimes. In 1999, Robert Sellers died in prison.
I do feel there was justice, especially when I found out that he died after he had been in prison. That was justice right there. When I remember Savannah, I think of this beautiful young woman, just the prettiest smile. She was very, very poised. I think she would have definitely had a bright future had her life not been taken in any sense of the manner, whether she had married and had a family or gone on in the business world. She just was a very lovely person.